Chapter 884. The Grand Master they refer to was none other than the Grand Master of Aoyama. The Grand Master of Aoyama was the first human ascendant. He created the sword work and left the sect of Aoyama, which had a supreme status in the cultivation world of Chaotian. General Li was the leader of the ascendants in this world, but the Grand Master was the one who determined the path of the humans and the spiritual leader of the ascendants, and he was like a beacon of light. The Grand Master of Aoyama was still alive, but nobody knew where he was. Jingjio was a disciple of Aoyama, but it was odd that he would ask an outsider this question. Back in the game of the Path Toward Heaven, Jingjio had asked General Li about the current situation of the Grand Master, but he didn't ask him where he was. This was a habit of the cultivation practitioners, and it had something to do with trust. The Grand Master of Aoyama was not in a good physical condition. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left behind Shun Yunmai, a descendant of his bloodline. In other words, the Grand Master would be in danger if the other swordsman knew where he was. As for why the other swordsmen wanted to harm the Grand Master, nobody knew. Killing the Grand Master of Aoyama was enough to excite some madmen. Jingjio was certain that the Grand Master of the Bloody Demon sect didn't know where the Grand Master of Aoyama was until his death, and Shun Yunmai didn't even know where his father was. Jingjio didn't ask General Li that question because he knew that General Li wouldn't answer him. It was because of the word trust mentioned at the moment. The Grand Master is not in a good condition, Sangju said while staring into Jingjio's eyes, a warning tone in his voice. Jingjio uttered, but it was obvious that he had no intention of withdrawing his question. Sangju said with furrowed eyebrows, he consumed a lot of energy back then because of the matter of that planet, so he's very weak. Jingjio knew that Jingjio was referring to the damaged planet, so he said, I know. Sangju furrowed his eyebrows even more, asking, why do you want to know this? Looking at the ocean of stars outside the cliff, Jingjio said, you want me to do these things and ignite these stars, so I need to trust you. Sangju said, you should know very well that these words have no meaning before they are put into practice. Jingjio said, if you don't trust me, how can I trust you? Sangju exclaimed incredulously. Among the 6 ascendants of the Aoyama sect, only the Great Grand Master and the immortal Chunyang are left. The rest of them have all died in the battles against the Sea of Dark Matter. How can you not trust your own sect? Jingjio said, you just said that these words are meaningless before they are put into practice. Sangju was silent for a long time again. Then he asked the fundamental question, what exactly do you want to do? Jingjio had no intention of hiding anything. I need a hostage, he said. What a vicious and evil idea. Instead, Sangju was convinced. He smiled bitterly and said, you people from the Aoyama sect are really a bunch of unreasonable weirdos. The sea of stars in the sky began to rotate, and a star map with a cloud-like edge appeared at the edge of the cliff. Then it rapidly enlarged, revealing its detailed appearance. It was a typical Bard galaxy. The Sea of Dark Matter could be seen at its edge, and most of the stars were still bright. Besides General Li, nobody knows where the Great Grand Master of Aoyama is. I've calculated it based on many years of observation, so it's not necessarily accurate. Pointing to a permanent star on the thin arm of the Bard galaxy, Sangju said, the Great Grandmaster might be here. The local galaxy where the Federation of the Milky Way was located was composed of 7 large galaxies. The Bard galaxy was located at the farthest place, and it had an incongruous name, the Milky Way. Jingjio didn't like to talk much. When he talked a lot, he did so in order to persuade others, and the effect was quite good. He was good at persuading the disciples of his big brother to betray him and making Yamatai one of their own. Sangju, the 7th house master of Yamatai, was not an exception either. He agreed to Jingjio's request because he had the heart of a saint. The Aoyama sect had always acted in an extreme manner, and it was always a good thing to have an internal check and balance. At the end of the conversation, Sangju said the following to Jingjio. This vacation is the last observation, but it's not what we're doing to you, but what you are doing to us. You've seen the Sea of Dark Matter, Huang Yu number 3, and even someone like the young Master Shun is willing to sacrifice himself. The purpose of cultivating is to ascend, but nobody knows what the fairy realm looks like before the ascension. The Federation of the Milky Way is not the fairy realm, but it's a beautiful place. It would be a pity if it became a graveyard. I'll persuade Qiao Yuan, and I hope you can join this great cause. Isn't it a kind of happiness to turn the hell into the fairy realm and find the direction of the path toward heaven? Zheng Ju's voice was mild and ordinary, but it sounded like the voice of Qiao Yuan in Jing Jiu's ears, sounding like the ringing of a bell. The ringing of the bell seemed to be echoing in his ears even after he returned to the suite. To put it bluntly, it sounded like the sound of a fly, which was rather annoying. Huashi poured a cup of tea for Jing Jiu and asked, "Are you going to stay here?" He uttered, while looking at the black and white barren land outside the window. Looking at the spot where the plasma beam broadsword had been, Shun Yunmai cursed in his mind. To put it more precisely, he cursed in his consciousness, which had nothing to do with his heart. The last traces left by the plasma beam broadsword had disappeared 17 minutes and 44 seconds ago. The gravitational field had been closed for a long time, and it was in a stable state. The discharge was no longer visible, and the outside particles were blocked from entering the room. As a result, the room was in absolute darkness. He had seen a lot of bullshit descriptions like absolute light is absolute darkness. He had always scoffed at such descriptions, thinking that these stupid authors didn't understand the difference between the beauty caused by the high-speed movement of particles and the terror caused by the absolute silence. Yet, he felt like cursing at the moment. He had been imprisoned for 7 days. He had tried to escape during this process, but he couldn't think of any way to escape. The gravitational field alone was enough to dispel all his ideas, not to mention that the servants were all wearing the devices that could shield the consciousness waves. All he could do now was wait for the arrival of the tide of the gravitational field. The problem was that nobody had been able to predict the arrival time of the tide of the gravitational field. It was an absolutely random phenomenon, which was enough to infuriate all the classical physicists. He couldn't do anything except pray. The question was, who was he praying to? Was it the dead ancient god, or the old man who was hiding somewhere? It seemed that a great and objective will had heard his prayers. A few faint flares appeared in the dark room. Were they the signs of the tide of the gravitational field? Or did someone come to bring him food? He didn't need to eat, so nobody would come to bring him food. So, the moment had arrived. Looking at the flares in silence, Shun Yunmai summoned an object from his messy hair with his psyche. It was a folded paper crane. It was no bigger than a grain of rice, even if it was flattened. Jing Jiu patted Shun Yunmai's head when he sent him back to the battleship. It was then that Jing Jiu hid the paper crane in Shun Yunmai's hair. Shun Yunmai was a swordsman in the starry sky who had been mechanically modified, and he was also a peerless genius who had learned Taoist magic arts and swordsmanship. It was natural that he knew how to use the paper crane. The moment the tide of the gravitational field appeared, a tiny crack in the space appeared in the dark world. The tiny paper crane burned into smoke and entered the crack. It passed through the crack and went to the cold and boundless universe. The crack in the space disappeared instantly, and the world returned to absolute darkness. Shun Yunmai was not as anxious and irritable as before. He was much calmer now because he had hope. It was a pity that the existence of hope was sometimes to make the despair more painful, and sometimes it was just an illusion. A wisp of ancient, faint, and indestructible divine awareness came from a distant place. It penetrated the gravitational field in an incomprehensible way and landed in Shun Yunmai's consciousness. Shun Yunmai's face couldn't turn pale, but the microchip in his brain started to discharge abnormally, and his calculating ability was severely reduced. All of these indicated a strong spiritual impact. The spiritual impact did not come from the divine awareness, but from the anger and restlessness in his body. It was obvious that the divine awareness could have destroyed the paper crane easily. But why didn't anything happen? The paper crane had disappeared in the cold universe. No matter how many days passed, it would surely fly to Jing Jiu's side one day. Why didn't the owner of the divine awareness stop him from sending the message? Jingjiu is too lazy. He is as immovable as a mountain, and there is no weakness. I had to find a way to make a move. Do you think he cares about my life or death? It might not be enough for him to come to the West, but you are his friend. We're not friends. People like Jingjiu don't have friends. I didn't expect that either. Now, I finally understand that when I set you up, I wanted you to be the second Jingjiu. That's why you two were naturally close. What on earth do you want to do? Even if you don't know why you want to mess with your most talented and outstanding disciple, why do you want to mess with me? It's not like I'm going to help him. You're going to help him, but it's not important. Only by erasing other possibilities can the probability be reduced. I get it now. It turns out that I'm a substitute. Though I don't know what you want me to do with Jingjiu, I don't need to exist now that he has appeared. If his path doesn't work, you still need me. As I said, it's a mathematical problem of probability collapse. Besides, I'll restart you when I need you. But Father, you're not a god. Having said this in his consciousness, Shun Yunmai refused to communicate with the divine awareness again. He closed his eyes and switched off the switch of consciousness, falling asleep. The battleship continued to advance toward the depths of the universe. Due to the gravitational field and the special coating, it didn't reflect any light. It looked extremely dark, like a black coffin. Chapter 885. Though Jingjiu agreed to the request of General Li and Tsingju to participate in the plan to ignite the permanent star, it didn't mean that he had to stay in the circular base like those scholars and specialists. He left the 857 planet on the same night and returned to the Scorching Sun battleship. The Scorching Sun battleship had been modified during the vacation. The computing core had been upgraded to the highest level in the Federation, and the wireless transmission capacity had been greatly enhanced. The biggest modification was carried out in the storage room of the battleship. The storage room, which had been full of nuclear bombs, had been emptied, looking exceedingly large and spacious. A chair was placed on the ground in the distance, which looked like an insignificant speck in comparison to the huge storage room. A faint blue glow came out from various information nodes, refracting on the smooth floor and walls, forming a beautiful but unrealistic scene. The chair was the soft chair on the balcony of the hotel at the University of Stargate. There was a small clay stove to the left of the chair, on which dozens of fine and good-looking silver coals were arranged in an orderly manner, the faint blue flames rising up like smoke. An iron kettle was placed on the stove, in which a faint green tea was boiled. Everything here was familiar to him. When an entire civilization came to serve a single person, anything unimaginable could happen. It was fortunate that Jingjiu didn't ask for it. Otherwise, Zhong Lizi would have stopped her studies at the College of Priests and been sent here as soon as possible. Seeing all this, Jingjiu's expression didn't change. He put the black backpack under the chair and lay down on it, knocking on the armrest lightly. Washi picked up the iron kettle and poured a cup of tea for Jingjiu. "Are we going to work here from now on?" she asked innocently with her eyes wide open. It was not a big deal to call it work, but the problem they had to solve was more important and troublesome. Washi took out a ceramic plate from the black backpack and put it by Jingjiu's right hand. She poured some sand into the plate, and then crouched by the side while supporting her chin with her hand, watching curiously. Jingjiu reached out his hand to the ceramic plate like he had done when they were in the small village by the sword washing stream and on the Shinma Peak. What was different this time was that Jingjiu didn't use his fingertips to pick up a grain of sand. Instead, he grabbed the sand in the ceramic plate roughly and let it fall down from his fingers. Following this action, the automatic metal racks on both sides of the warehouse began to rustle. These metal racks had once held countless multi-phase nuclear bombs. When he was in the Hyene Nebula, Jingjiu had released all of them and used them as the source of immortal aura, which had helped him destroy that battleship and kill Reverend Qisong. What was placed on these automatic metal racks? It was a chess piece. Countless black and white chess pieces poured down like tens of thousands of waterfalls, slowly covering the spacious floor of the warehouse. Washi turned around and looked at these images. She covered her ears with her hands and opened her mouth slightly. After an unknown amount of time, the sound of the chess pieces hitting the ground finally stopped. The black and white chess pieces silently floated up and floated in the air under the guidance of some invisible force. Back when they were on the chessboard mountain in Zhaoga City, Jing Jiu had set up a similar three-dimensional Go game for Tong Yin, but it couldn't be compared to this one. If this was a chess game, it would undoubtedly be the most complicated one in the history of human civilization. These black and white chess pieces were not arranged according to the rules of the Go game. In some places, hundreds of black chess pieces were connected together, and in some places, only white chess pieces were placed. The ascendants who had been to the underground of Planet 857 and seen that patch of starry sky could recognize that the distribution of these black and white chess pieces was similar to that patch of starry sky. Looking at the densely packed chess pieces in the sky, Huashi asked in surprise, "How many are there in total?" 490 million white chess pieces and 300 black chess pieces, replied Jingjiu. The information nodes hidden on the ground and in the walls continued to emit blue glows, and a great deal of data entered the warehouse through the specially built encrypted channels. The ring glowed faintly for a moment and then disappeared. The information had entered his awareness. Huashi wanted to say something. "Block it," said Jingjiu. It was unclear to whom he was talking to. The information blocking wall on the battleship started to work, and the warehouse became an independent world. Huashi walked to the soft chair and was about to sit down. "No," said Jingjiu. Huashi looked at him in silence. Jingjiu didn't say anything. Huashi said, "These chess pieces are far from enough." "This is the cross-section," said Jingjiu. Huashi said, "I'll go back then. You can do the calculations here." "You have to do the calculations for me," said Jingjiu. "There's no place to sit," said Huashi. After a moment of silence, Jingjiu said, "Sit down." Huashi sat down in front of the soft chair. It was the seat she usually sat on the balcony of the hotel at the University of Stargate. It was the seat Zhao Lei usually sat on the Shima Peak. It was like hundreds of millions of chess pieces had their own positions in a vast and spacious warehouse. Time passed slowly. The black and white chess pieces hovered in the air in silence, their positions unchanged. Sitting at the end of the chair, Huashi lifted her small face and looked at them for a long time. In the end, she decided to give up, just like she had done every time in the past. The plan to ignite the permanent star required an unimaginable amount of calculation, and it was the easiest part to solve. The most troublesome part was that the changes in the universe couldn't be carried out according to the mathematical rules. The sea of dark matter didn't have a subjective consciousness, but it was not an inanimate object. She turned her head to check on Jingjiu. Looking back, she had imagined several possibilities. His face might have turned pale because he had used up too much of his energy, or his face might have turned ugly because he had no idea how to solve the situation, or his face might have turned red because he was in despair. However, she had never imagined that she would see such a scene. Lying on the chair with his eyes closed, Jingjiu seemed to be asleep, killing a man from 1,000 miles away, refusing to take 10 steps. Huashi had read the book and was aware of this guy's lifestyle in Chaotian, but she still couldn't get used to it. Was he stalling for time or doing nothing? Jingjiu suddenly opened his eyes. Huashi opened her eyes wide, as if she was startled. Countless fine sword lights appeared in the deep end of his eyes and then disappeared, as if they were some calculating tools. His fingers moved quickly, picking up the fine sand in the ceramic plate. He didn't create a new mountain or river, but he was solving a geometric problem. A part of the Go pieces in the sky, tens of thousands of them, began to move at an unimaginably fast speed. He was not playing chess. Once in a while, a few black Go pieces would appear, but they weren't taken away. The black and white Go pieces were flowing like water. Actually, it was the light and dark matter that were released and spread in a large space. It was the result of two beings with different natures meeting and contending with each other, and they would even merge once in a while. It was like two rivers breaking through their respective bends and meeting each other before a peninsula. Some of them were sensei, and some were turbid. They surrounded each other and then tore each other apart, forming their own small groups and living in each other's worlds stubbornly. Tens of thousands of Go pieces were rotating and changing their positions, creating an impressive visual scene, resembling a metal that could change its shape along with the electric current. Jingjio looked at those Go pieces in silence. The sword lights in his eyes grew brighter, and the Go pieces appeared more and more frequently. Looking at his face, Huashi's eyes grew brighter. She could vaguely see the word hope in her clear and clean eyes. After an unknown period of time, the distinction between the black and white Go pieces was no longer clear. They were entangled in one place like chaos. If it were an ordinary cultivation practitioner, he would probably lose control of his Taoist heart and be seriously injured just by glancing at that place. Huashi was a little nervous, and her mouth was a little dry. She casually picked up Jingjio's teacup and took a sip. Jingjio glanced at her and casually raised his finger and pointed at the sky. A white chess piece had appeared between his fingers at some point in time. That white Go piece fell among hundreds of millions of Go pieces. It was like a spark falling into a dynamite. It was like a basin of oil falling into a raging fire. It was like a drop of water falling into hot oil. There was a loud bang. The tens of thousands of Go pieces in that corner exploded into countless pieces and then fell to the ground and became ashes. I should prepare a box on the ground. Chapter 886. In fact, it was not accurate to say that the white Go piece condensed by the blazing fire was burned out. When Jingjio put the white Go piece condensed by his awareness into the sky, it was more like someone throwing a pebble into the water by the lake of the 1,000-mile windy corridor. The ripples on the surface of the lake spread out in all directions, but they would eventually subside somewhere. It was the case for the white Go piece. It caused the Go pieces around it to fall down and break into pieces one after another until they reached a place 100 meters away. The rest of the black and white Go pieces were not affected, hovering in their original positions in silence. The process looked more like the sudden collapse of the space than the destruction of the Go pieces. "What is that?" asked Huashi while looking at the space left behind by the falling Go piece. What she asked was the white Go piece Jingjio had dropped from the sky. "The supernova," said Jingjio while looking at the spot. To put it more precisely, it was a supernova that had exploded in advance and was much more powerful than what had been calculated. The violent explosion of the supernova had sent out an unimaginable amount of light and heat, shaking and twisting the space in the universe and triggering many chain reactions. It was, of course, very difficult and even impossible to calculate the process clearly. It would take a supercomputer a long time to run the calculation on a macroscopic level. From the moment the Scorching Sun battleship arranged the Go game to the moment he put down the Go piece, Jingjio had thought for a while with his eyes closed. Normally, this was something worth marveling at, but Huashi shook her head slightly. The black Go piece represented the sea of dark matter drifting in the space of the galaxy, and the white Go piece represented the celestial bodies mainly composed of the permanent stars. Jingjio holding the white Go piece meant the plan to ignite the permanent stars. The purpose of these calculations was to let the exploding permanent stars erode those cracks in the space and reduce the area of the sea of dark matter as much as possible, or even make it disappear. There were many hypotheses and deductions in the scientific community on how to make a star explode. For example, the most common one, which also sounded possible, was to use a mass object that was infinitely close to the speed of light to directly penetrate the star, thereby triggering a series of internal reactions in the star, leading to the occurrence of an explosion. However, what kind of object could have a mass that was close to the speed of light? If the technological level of the human civilization had reached such a level, there was no need to worry about the sea of dark matter. Similar ideas were stuck at the scientific level and could not be turned into reality. From a certain point of view, a supernova was the most suitable star to ignite because it was old and dying on the verge of exploding. But Huashi thought that Jingjio's idea was also a dead end. Based on the number and classification of stars in the galaxy, there There would be a supernova event every 3 years. A supernova explosion looked extremely spectacular and terrifying, but in the vast universe, it was actually just a firework. Other than looking good, there was no other meaning. Even if he could really ignite a supernova and maximize its power through those chain reactions, it would only affect a corner of the universe. For instance, as the white Go piece fell down, tens of thousands of Go pieces had turned into ashes, indicating that a large number of permanent stars had perished together with the sea of dark matter. However, the area of the sea of dark matter was still too small compared to that of 300 years ago. What was more troublesome was that the flames ejected by the supernova explosion were still far from the speed of light. How could they pass through the vast sea of stars and reach the other side of the galaxy to encircle the sea of dark matter? Jingzhou's idea required at least hundreds of supernovae to explode at the same time. It was because of the upper limit of the speed at which information could be transmitted, which meant that the speed of the weapon that ignited the permanent star had to be faster than the speed of light, or in other words, faster than the concept of speed. Back to the previous question, where could they find a weapon that could travel faster than the speed of light? The plan to ignite the permanent star seemed to have two aspects, but the method and sequence of the ignition could actually be combined into one problem. What was the weapon that ignited the permanent star back then? What does it have to do with the weapon that destroyed 857? If it was an antimatter gun, the distant ancient civilization should have kept many records about it, Jingzhou said. It was unclear if he was asking someone or talking to himself. Huashi said, they wouldn't choose to perish together with the enemy until the very end. As such, the idea that the distant ancient civilization had made thorough preparations and at least left enough information is just a poetic imagination. George Carlin once said that it is foolish and meaningless to make the reality poetic. The meaning of this statement was profound, and it contained too much information. Jingzhou didn't say anything more. He closed his eyes and continued to ponder on how to destroy this universe. The scorching sun battleship was floating in the universe in silence. The distant permanent star, 857, had almost disappeared from the field of vision, and the stars on its back served as the background. The officers and soldiers on the battleship had no mission or anything to do. They didn't even know why the battleship was parked here. They rested, and rested every day except for the routine checks and studies. All kinds of activities were carried out on such a boring day. The pre-selection of all kinds of weightless football matches had begun. The sparks of love were blossoming everywhere. Some soldiers who liked to walk on foot had even walked a few times on the main bridge of the battleship, a long journey of 200 kilometers. However, there was always a quiet place on the battleship, no matter how lively it was. It was impossible for the sparks of love to ignite that place, and the soldiers on foot couldn't get close to that place either. Hundreds of millions of chess pieces were floating in the air in silence in the warehouse. Jingzhou was lying on a chair with his eyes closed. Huashi was squatting by the small mud stove, her line of sight shifting between the iron kettle and the bright red silver coals. It was unclear what she was thinking. The scene was like the top of the Shima Peak, except that there was no spring rain, autumn wind, or winter snow. If the days went on like this, it would be a peaceful and pleasant life. A few years later, Zhao Leiyu and Zhuruzhui would come out from Chaotian to help him get rid of those troublesome people, and Tongyan would come out to help him get rid of those troublesome chess pieces. It would be even better. His expectation of Lu Shui and Gu Qin grew lower and lower. It was troublesome to have a partner in the cultivation world and a hindrance in the Dao heart. As for the others, Ping Yongka wanted to rule the world. Apiao wanted to rule the underworld. Qin Yang didn't have enough talent, and Yuan Shu didn't have enough intelligence. All of them had a hard time, so he couldn't count on them. Unfortunately, this patch of the universe was full of changes, not as stable and monotonous as Chaotian. It was hard to maintain the word peaceful and pleasant. A few days later, an important document arrived on the Scorching Sun battleship through the secret channel. This document was what he asked Hua Shi and Ran Handong to find out, including everything related to Jian Shilai's ascension. The information provided by Hua, she was more detailed and abundant than the information provided by the military. The first video he saw was the battle on the mineral planet. On the surface of the dark gray mineral planet, the red overcoat was quite eye-catching, even a bit dazzling. He saw Jian Shilai's defeat and heard Jian Shilai's dreadful screams, and then he saw more things. From the mineral planet to the battleship and to the secret base of the military, Jian Shilai had suffered countless mental attacks, which was an unimaginably painful torture. While she had seen those scenes and heard those dreadful screams, but she was still moved. Thinking of the scene where Jian Shilai walked into the battleship in a military uniform and a black overcoat with a sunny face, she felt a bit disgusted. "You won't do anything, will you?" she asked nervously while looking at Jingjiao. "Will you agree to my request?" Jingjiao's voice was very calm, and his expression was as nonchalant as usual. It seemed that he was not affected by these documents. "I don't even know what you're talking about," Huashi exclaimed with widened eyes. "But you are a disciple of Aoyama." Jingjiao got up and left. Looking at the door that looked like a black dot a few kilometers away, the mocking intent in Huashi's eyes fading away. Her eyes were so cold that they seemed devoid of any human emotion. This was the first time Jingjiao had left the storehouse since he came to the Scorching Sun battleship. The officers and soldiers who were running in the passageways, shouting in the living quarters, and watching the lovers under the starlight by the windows had all noticed his figure. They stood at attention and saluted reflexively, feeling startled. It wasn't until this moment that many officers and soldiers realized that he had been on the battleship the entire time. Walking on the bustling battleship that seemed to be in the human world, his figure seemed different, as if he were in another place. Many scenes flashed in his awareness again. Jian Shilai had been modified many times. Those modifications were cruel, both physically and mentally. As the last hint of madness in the deep end of his eyes gradually subsided, he seemed to have died and obtained a new life. A stone statue had broken into pieces and turned into a living person. Looking at the incomplete body of Jian Shilai, soaking in the nutrient fluid, Jingjiao felt that he was looking at the head of Shun Yunmai, soaking in the nutrient fluid. After returning to the suite in the front of the battleship and setting up the inherited heaven sword formation, the ring on his finger emitted a faint glow, connecting his awareness to the military network. It didn't take long for him to get in touch with Jian Shilai in the Central Star Fleet. Looking at the familiar yet strange face on the light screen, Jingjiao asked without hesitation, "Do you remember everything that has happened to you?" "Yes, I remember everything," replied Jian Shilai after a moment of silence. Jingjiao uttered, and was about to cut off the communication. "I understand your concern. I'd like to say that I know what I'm doing, but I don't think you will believe me." Jian Shilai suddenly said, "Keep watching me. If I'm not me, please wake me up." Jingjiao didn't respond, nor was he moved. He cut off the communication. If he couldn't wake up a person who pretended to be asleep, how could he wake up a person who thought he was awake? It was impossible to light a fire, kill a dead person, bring a living person back to life, or repair a computer that was not broken. This was the truth. It was not the twice-cooked pork after all. The inherited heaven sword formation was dismantled. The door of the room was opened. Huashi walked in with the iron kettle in her hand. Jingjiao came to the window and looked at the dark space. "Is there any news from Shinyamai?" he asked suddenly. Huashi replied innocently, "He has only a head left. How can he contact you?" "There's a problem," Jingjiao said. Huashi said, "I can understand that you care about Jian Shilai. After all, you and Jian Shilai came out together. According to the standard of human beings, we should be classmates, the same period or the same year," Jingjiao said. Huashi shrugged and continued asking, "Why do you care about Shinyamai so much? Since when did you get along so well with him? He has a high talent and an interesting life. You think a bit like me." Jingjiao said, "I think he should be my disciple." Chapter 887. This statement was extremely narcissistic and almost overbearing. Anyone with a high talent an interesting life, and a lot of thinking should be his disciple. That was why Jing Jiu had sighed with emotion when he saw Peng Lang and was dissatisfied with Lu Shui, Gu Qing, and Yuan Chu. I don't care about the others, but I don't care about being interesting. Huashi pouted her mouth and continued. A person with a strong sense of anxiety, like you, can't be interesting. That guy is the son of your grandmaster and has many supporters in the military. Nobody has ever dared offend him. You're the first and the only one. Did she have no intention of continuing the act? As Jing Jiu was about to clarify something, the ring on his finger emitted a faint glow, indicating that he had received another document. The document was a list of names and an accurate space coordinate. Tsangju had reminded Jing Jiu that there would be a meeting in a few days before he went to see the ocean with Shun Yunmai. Looking at the densely packed names on the list, Jing Jiu fell silent for a while. He saw a few familiar names on the list. They were all the ascendants recorded in the history of the cultivation world in Chaotian. For instance, the Stone Man on Chunwu Mountain and the immortal Liuhe of the Dongyi Dao. The former had hidden on the meteorite mountain on that planet, intending to harm him. When he met with General Li, the latter was hiding on a battleship, ready to strike at him at any moment. Yet, he had never heard of most of the names and the introductions attached to them. How could there be so many ascendants in Chaotian? It seemed that the books and records could only record a small part of the truth of history. This fact made him feel shocked and alarmed him. The space coordinate was the place where the meeting would be held. There was a regular permanent star outside the fog on the outskirts of the 71st passage of the Scorpion Tail Nebula. There was an asteroid belt in the extreme periphery of the permanent star. There was a small asteroid with a diameter of 300 kilometers in the asteroid belt. The asteroid belt was far away from the permanent star, and it was exceedingly cold and harsh. The reason the meeting was held there had nothing to do with cultivation. It was because it was absolutely safe, and there was no need to worry about the information being leaked. The icy and dreadful asteroid was covered with methane ice and snow, and the magnetic storm was very severe. The regular humans would die, without a doubt, even if they wore the best spacesuits. Only those who had been tempered by immortal chi could stay there for a long time with their own energy. Magnetic storm. There are some problems. Are you sure you want to go? Huashi looked into his eyes and said, not hiding the warning in her voice. Jing Jiu said, leave if you have something to do. Huashi's gaze fell on his hand, and she said, if something is broken, it's meaningless to repair it. Over the last few days, Jing Jiu had gone to the Sea of Dark Matter, the holiday planet, to see the sea, the sun, and since the aftermath of the explosion of the small sun at the bottom of the ocean. After experiencing so many things, the ring on his finger was severely damaged, even though it was protected by the sword wheels. The signal on his finger was not as good as before after being repaired. You can get a new one, Jing Jiu said as he looked into her eyes, as if he was issuing some kind of invitation. While she turned her head and looked at the hundreds of millions of chess pieces in the air. There was no expression on her face. No one knew what she was thinking or hesitating about. The Scorching Sun battleship left the outer edge of the galaxy 857 and headed toward the deeper part of the universe. It arrived at the Scorching Sun Nebula 6 days and 800 minutes later. The Scorching Sun Nebula was a patch of stable interstellar dust, spanning thousands of light years. There were more than 100 entrances to the warped black holes, one of which led to the famous industrial galaxy in the Federation of the Milky Way. A great many mineral stars were turned into powder and sent there every day. All kinds of spaceships traveled through the nebula. Though it was hard to see any traces of the nebula with the naked eyes, the communication system and the information screen showed that the nebula was very lively, resembling the center of the cities on the inhabited planets. In comparison to the bustling interstellar passageway, the newly formed galaxy at the bottom of the nebula appeared much more deserted. Looking at it from here, the Scorching Sun Nebula looked like the new fog above the river hanging in the sky, and also like the fog above the river under their feet. The name of the galaxy beyond the fog was probably related to the nebula. Some ascendants who were participating in the meeting had arrived here in advance. More than 10 black battleships were hidden in the darkness in the space of tens of billions of kilometers, looking like alien planets, devoid of energy fluctuations. These battleships were the vehicles of the ascendants. Like the battleship of the immortal Qi Song destroyed by Jing Jiao, these battleships had the most advanced technology and the most powerful weapons in the Federation of the Milky Way. Shilai hadn't arrived yet. He was the commander of the Star Nuclear Fleet. It sounded impressive, but the authority and position meant nothing to a person like him. What mattered most was that he was safe and sound. Jing Jiao was certain that something had happened to him. That man had come ashore on the foggy island in the south by boat. He had endured the pressure from the Aoyama sect for hundreds of years, until he became a godly swordsman. Those sunny smiles and cordial expressions shouldn't have appeared on his face. These were not necessarily fake. They could be the true self he had hidden in his heart for many years. The expressionless and statue-like godly swordsman of West Ocean was the true self he had after hundreds of years of cultivation. However, the purpose of cultivation was to change oneself. Huashi paraphrased George Carlin's words, "Any act of poeticizing reality is foolish and meaningless." Jing Jiao didn't know who George Carlin was, but he thought what George Carlin had said was sensible. The saying that one was naive and would naturally attain the Tao was artistic, but it was unrealistic. It meant that one didn't know anything and didn't have a pure heart. This kind of poetic or idyllic imagination was a lie made up by the weak after they realized their own incompetence. It was essentially a form of surrender. Jing Jiao might be a fugitive, but he would never surrender. He had the patience, courage, and most importantly, confidence that nobody else, including those ascendants, had. The hundreds of millions of black and white go pieces in the sky represented the most difficult problem in the universe. After solving this problem, he intended to spend 100 years to solve it. If Tong Yin could come out earlier, he would have an easier time, but he had no way to go back to Chaotian right now. Thinking of this, he felt a bit self-deprecating. If he had known that Chaotian was a place he couldn't go back to, he wouldn't have fought with the mother of the highest state until the last moment. He blinked his eyelashes slightly. He cut off all the unnecessary thoughts of the past and threw them into the void of his awareness. He looked at the hundreds of millions of go pieces again. All of a sudden, the black and white go pieces quivered slightly in his sight, as if a wave had occurred among them, spreading out in all directions. The wave was only a few micrometers high, which couldn't be seen by the naked eye. As such, it had no effect on the Go game. If the black and white Go pieces were regarded as the ocean, it was the wave nonetheless. It was a whim. Jing Jiao looked at the outside of the battleship. There was no window in the storage room of the nuclear bombs. Even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see much light, and most of the invisible radiation had been blocked out. Yet, Jing Jiao seemed to have seen something, disappearing from the original spot. A bright sword light appeared on the surface of the ocean formed by the black and white Go pieces, dispersing like music. He came to the outside of the battleship. The fog-like scorpion tail nebula exuded a faint glow in the distance. The galaxy beyond the fog was gloomy and gloomy. All of a sudden, a faint glow flew out from the gloomy darkness. It was an extremely small light crane. He extended his right hand. The light crane landed on his palm and instantly dissipated into clear light. Then, it dispersed into particles and disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the information it carried. Jing Jiao looked at the dark universe, a bright sword light flashing in his eyes. Countless rays of light of various frequencies entered his eyes and compared them with the images in his awareness. He determined the positions of the 7 battleships and the specific situation of 3 of them. Back then, he had used the nuclear bomb of the Scorching Sun battleship as a source of fairy energy to strike down the immortal Qi Song in that battleship. Now, he didn't have a nuclear bomb, but he had the superparticle nuclear power furnace, so he should be able to strike down 2 ascendants and 2 battleships. If he was pushed to the limit, he could also try to strike down the 3rd battleship. There shouldn't be many ascendants as strong as the blood demon great ancestor. He returned to the battleship, picked up the iron kettle, and placed it on the stove. When a thin layer of snow had formed on the surface of the silver coals, the tea was ready. The tea trickled into the cup. He picked it up with his fingers, making sure that the temperature was just right, and placed it in front of Hua Shi. Hua Shi picked up the teacup and had a sip of it, expressing her gratitude. Her job was to serve him, which was even worse than Ran Hondong's secretary role. As such, it was impossible for him to pour the tea for her. Yet, he poured the tea for her naturally, and she accepted it calmly. It was because they both knew the price of this cup of tea. Are you sure that you can't do it physically? This was the second time Jing Jiu had asked this question. Hua Shi uttered softly, and then sighed. It seemed that she felt regretful. It was unclear if it was because of the taste of the tea or the answer. Jing Jiu said while looking at the teacup between her fingers, holding the teacup is also a kind of physical manipulation. Hua Shi said softly, I can do it as much as I can. The former referred to her ability, and the latter referred to her authority. Jing Jiu understood what she meant, saying, my ability is very strong. Hua Shi understood what he meant as well. You are a disciple of the Aoyama sect. I can't trust you, she said earnestly while staring into his eyes. Jing Jiu said, you have read my book, so you should know that our Aoyama sect is good at deceiving the masters and destroying the ancestors. Chapter 888. Jing Jiu thought that he could convince Hua Shi and that person behind her, and then solve all the problems smoothly. Those problems included the mental control of Jian Shilai, the imprisonment of Shun Yunmai, and everything else he would have to face. Jian Shilai would arrive in an hour and a half, and generally would arrive in 2 days, so he had enough time. The situation on the main planet was a bit unstable. The Ran clan and other clans had voiced their opinions thanks to the explosion of the resort planet, and even the Hua clan had taken a stand. It would take some time for General Li to deal with those problems, but he didn't want to kill everybody. Of course, he could solve those problems easily. Jing Jiu came back to the room at the head of the battleship. The space outside the window was still as dark as ever, devoid of any light. He wondered if his place would be illuminated after those permanent stars were ignited. What are you preparing for? Hua Shi asked. In the story you wrote, you cultivation practitioners should avoid getting involved in the cause and effect. Standing before the window and looking at the battleships hidden in the darkness, Jing Jiu said nothing. He had felt something was out of place many days ago. It was not the day when the space crack appeared on the resort planet, the day when the Huangyu No. 3 planet attacked, the day when he arrived at the 857 base, the day when he talked to General Li on the land of the South Pole on the main planet, and the day when he met the immortal Chi Song and his battleship in the High Nebula. It was much earlier. It was the day when he woke up in the underground laboratory on the Stargate and came to the Mingxing neighborhood. He saw the TV screen and the news in that apartment building. Since that day, he had felt something was out of place. Everything felt unreal, making him feel a bit uneasy. The figures in the heavenly arrival state could sense the changes of heaven and earth and could almost predict them, not to mention that he was now an ascended ferryman. The problem was the world after ascension. This vast universe was almost infinite, so the sense was not accurate anymore. Moreover, there was a fog-like force blocking the path ahead, making it impossible for him to calculate the future changes clearly. Someone made it hard for him to calculate the future, which was a problem in itself. The fact that he couldn't calculate the future and the outcome didn't mean that he couldn't calculate the future. At least, he could see if the ground under his feet was even. He had been meditating in the storeroom of the Scorching Sun battleship over the last few days, thinking about the plan to ignite the permanent stars while facing the go pieces in the sky. But he spent most of his time calculating other things. It seemed that the person sitting on the opposite side of the chessboard was playing his go pieces illogically. Neither Jian Shilai nor Shin Yunmai could figure out his purpose. Where should he place his go pieces then? In the end, he decided to go straight to the middle. A black warship slowly sailed out of the Scorpion Tail Nebula like a ghost, passed through a short distance channel and arrived near the galaxy beyond the fog. A faint beam of sword light illuminated the universe for a moment, and there were some faint ripples like a tide. The patterns on the surface of the kettle were also illuminated. Huashi sat on the sofa in the corner with a doll in her arms, looking at the two of them. Jingjiu poured a cup of tea for Jian Shilai and said, "There is something wrong with your brain." It was like opening the door to a bedroom and seeing a giant battleship the size of a mountain charging at them. Jian Shilai held the teacup and looked at the clear tea in it. "Evidence," he said after a moment of silence. With his voice, the room was filled with a mist-like aura. More than 10 sword lights appeared on the huge window with the dark universe as the background. A sword formation of inherited heaven took shape. At the same time, a great deal of information was transmitted to Jian Shilai's awareness through his spiritual awareness. It took Jian Shilai a short time to read all the information. "Thank you," he said to Jingjiu earnestly. Jian Shilai looked so miserable in those scenes that anybody would feel angry or even break down, but he was as calm as ever. "You said that you knew everything that had happened to you the other day. It looks like you're telling the truth." Jingjiu was not surprised. Since generally intended to subdue Jian Shilai, he wouldn't leave any loopholes. Jian Shilai said, "I know you mean well and want me to wake up, but I'm awake." Jingjiu didn't finish his sentence but asked directly, "Does it hurt?" He was asking about the physical and mental pain Jian Shilai had suffered from since he came to the lab on the mining planet. The sense of pain was a defense mechanism generated by the nervous system to protect the whole body. This mechanism would weaken gradually when the cultivation practitioners started to strengthen their bodies, but it would grow stronger as their cultivation state increased. Even though the bodies tempered by the fairy energy of the ascendants were no longer mortal bodies, they still retained the corresponding senses, and their senses were many times more sensitive than those of mortals. In other words, when the fairy men could feel pain, it would be many times more painful than that of mortals. Jian Shilai didn't want to recall that period of time, so he uttered, briefly. "Is it humiliating?" Jingjiu asked. Being treated like a lab rat or a frog by the military technicians would be a humiliation for any mortal, to say nothing of the fairy men. Jian Shilai said, "As long as I know all this, I can accept it." "Why can you accept it?" asked Jingjiu. "The 7th and the 37th sect masters of Aoyama are both dead," Jian Shilai continued. "If the humans want to survive this war, they have to sacrifice themselves. I don't think I'm an exception. After all, I'm not you." This was what Sangju meant. Jingjiu said, "That man of the West Ocean doesn't believe in the word sacrifice. At least he won't allow it to happen to him. It's because the West Ocean is too small, and Chaotian is too small for us to get out. But the universe is too vast, and we have nowhere to go, so we need a place to stay. The reason is simple. The farmers will save some firewood and repair the houses during the winter break. When the wild animals come down the mountain, they will fight them with the steel forks. Of course, they're afraid of death, but it's because they don't want to die that they don't fear death." Jian Shilai asked Jingjiu while holding the teacup in his hand, "Similarly, you've changed a lot since you came to this world. For instance, you care about my life and death now." "I don't care about it," said Jingjiu. He didn't do all this to save Jian Shilai, at least not all of them. He, the immortal Tan, Jian Shilai, and Chao Yuan should be counted as one of the ascendants who had left Chaotian. It was rare in the history of Chaotian that a few ascendants had appeared consecutively in such a short period of time. In fact, it had never happened before. On a deeper level, it was because of Jingjiu's existence. It was natural for him to feel a sense of closeness to these guys, the same way he felt to those little guys who were still in Chaotian. This was the instinct of the intelligent beings, so he didn't have to overcome it. As such, he didn't overcome it. However, he wasn't willing to risk his life for these people. However, he had sensed something was out of place after he came to this world, and the light crane brought him the news of Shen Yunmai a few days ago. The path toward heaven was toward heaven, and they all walked their own paths. The more people on his side, the better. The saying that those who achieve the Tao would receive more help was just another way of saying that that those who received more help would achieve the Tao. As for whether he would be affected by more karma, as Huashi said, he didn't care much about it. He had a brand new understanding of karma after he was reborn and embarked on the path of cultivation. It couldn't be cut off, and it was messy. It couldn't be avoided. Now that the immortal doesn't care about it, why are you telling me all this? Jian Shilai said with a bitter smile. Jing Jiao said, You said the other day that you wanted me to wake you up when I needed you. Jian Shilai said with a smile. Immortal, just pretend that I'm sleeping. Jing Jiao said, Those who sleep will dream. I like to go into your dream to have a look. Hearing this, Jian Shilai fell silent for a long time. It was because he understood that Jing Jiao intended to enter his spiritual world. This was tantamount to opening up his spiritual world to the other party, which was an extremely dangerous thing to do. It would be fine if he were an ordinary person, but Jing Jiao's spiritual awareness was so powerful that he could kill him easily with a single thought. From a mining planet to the laboratory of the military base, the subordinates of generally had employed countless methods to force him to give up resisting and open up his spiritual world. As a result, the dreadful scenes had occurred. He had endured the extreme pain for more than 30 days at the time. Now, Jing Jiao wanted to achieve the same result. Okay, Jian Shilai suddenly said, raising the teacup and emptying it. After drinking a cup of tea, Jing Jiao left the troubles in the human world and entered the world of awareness. What he saw was a patch of thick fog, which must be the islands in the South Ocean. Jing Jiao didn't want to look back at Jian Shilai's childhood memories because he might see some mental trauma, but it had nothing to do with him. Where is it? He asked. Jian Shilai waved his hand to disperse the thick fog in front of him. He glanced at the innocent children on the beach reluctantly, saying, Come with me. They left the islands in the South Ocean and boarded a shabby boat that traveled faster than the speed of light. As soon as they got ashore, they saw a small fishing village. All the people in the small fishing village had died later on. Next, they went to the West Ocean. After taking a look at the countless tides and the traces left by the disgraced ferryman, they turned eastward and came to a barren plain. This place was exceedingly barren, devoid of any green traces or puddles. Jian Shilai remarked sentimentally, It said that in the eyes of us ferrymen, the changes in the world are nothing special, but how many of us can actually witness it with our own eyes? Jing Jiao said, It's conceivable that this place will become a river 100 years later. No sooner had he finished speaking than a large crack appeared on the ground of the barren plain. Countless springs gushed out and filled the crack instantly, turning it into a large river. This is not the power of time. You are cheating, Jian Shilai said with a bitter smile. Jing Jiao said, We are also a part of time. The end of the river was the most secretive and important place in Jian Shilai's spiritual world. If there was an imprint of thought, it should be there. However, the imprint had merged with Jian Shilai's spiritual world, so he couldn't discover it himself. Jing Jiao had thought about how the imprint would appear in Jian Shilai's spiritual world. It could be a bronze gate, an oil lamp, or a sword, but he didn't expect the imprint to be a person. A young Taoist priest was fishing by the shore, wearing a red Taoist robe. The red color was rather eye-catching in the barren world. You shouldn't come here. The young Taoist priest lifted his head and said to Jing Jiao. Seeing this scene, Jing Jiao thought of his big brother, and then he felt bored and angry. The other person was not Tai Pingzhenren, but his great-grandmaster, the immortal Chunyang. Chapter 889. The river divided the wilderness into two worlds. The young Taoist priest sat on the opposite bank, and Jing Jiao and Jian Shilai sat on this side. After walking for a while from the South Pine Pavilion to the back of the mountain, one could see a small building. Inside the building hung the portraits of the previous leaders of the Aoyama sect, as well as some elders who had special significance to the sect. Jing Jiao had seen those portraits and remembered what the great grandmaster looked like. He had also seen him in the game a few days ago, as well as in the Modern Art Museum of the main planet South Pole. Compared to General Li, who was wearing a military uniform, this young Taoist priest in a Taoist robe was more similar to the great ancestral master in his memory, which made him feel even more strange. He did not like the red Taoist robe that the other party was wearing, even though he knew that it should reflect the red cloak and had nothing to do with his senior brother. At the same time, he didn't like what the other party had said. You shouldn't have come here. Perhaps it was because his grandmaster, Reverend Daoyuan, and his master, Reverend Chinzhou, had died when he was very young, so no one had ever taken care of Jingyang. Thus, he was very unused to having someone speak to him like an elder, even if that person was his grandmaster. Jian Shilai seemed to be in an even worse mood than he was, and he disliked this sentence even more. This was because this was the most secret and core place in his spiritual world. If Jingjio shouldn't have come, then why did that young Taoist stay here? Although I don't believe what he said, I've actually examined my spirit carefully many times. Why haven't I found you? The young Taoist priest was a spiritual soul left by General Li in the spiritual world of Jianshilai. He could be regarded as the main formation operator of the imprint of thought, or he could be regarded as the gatekeeper. He had merged deeply into this patch of heaven and earth, so Jianshilai couldn't discover him or drive him out. As such, Jingjio didn't pay any attention to Jianshilai's cold question. All he did was look at Jingjio in silence, and said again, "You shouldn't come here." This surging river in the wilderness was very magical. The closer it was to the source, the stronger the water became. The river water washed away the soil, and from time to time, it would bring down rocks, creating a rumbling sound. However, it could not drown out the young Taoist's voice. Jingjio said, "I don't like it." The young Taoist said, "Aoyama has always been like that." This was indeed the style of the Aoyama sect. The sword jail at the bottom of the Shangda Peak, the dead dog walking in the passageways, the corpses in the hermit peaks, and many other evidences. Jingjio said, "Don't have anything to do with me." The young Taoist said, "If you don't come, this matter has nothing to do with you. In fact, I really don't want to see you here." After saying this, he sighed, full of regret and pity. It was just like Jingjio was an outstanding student who should have gotten full marks on the test paper, but he forgot to write his name. It was like a person who had gone through a long trial and could finally get a higher official position, but at the last moment, he flipped the table of the leader. Jingjio disliked such things the most, and he disliked being criticized by others the most. He walked to the riverside and looked across, saying, "Do you want to go by yourself? Or do you want me to give you a ride?" The young Taoist asked, "What exactly do you want to give him?" "Alive," said Jingjio. The young Taoist raised the bamboo rod and said while pointing at Jian Shilai, "He is not dead." Jingjio said, "There's a kind of person who is alive, but he is already dead." The young Taoist asked, "What does the life and death of others have to do with you?" Jingjio said, "When you see someone about to die, you will help him because you hope that someone will help you when you are in danger. Even though you didn't think of all this when you made the decision, and even though you didn't think of all this when you were enlightened and watched those heroic deeds, it is the fact." "So," pressed the young Taoist. Jingjio continued, "Morality originates from fear, and all the fear originates from death. I don't want to die, and I don't want others to die either." "Does others mean anyone?" pressed the young Taoist. Jingjio replied, "Anyone who doesn't want me to die." The young Taoist said, "In that case, you shouldn't care about his life and death." Having said that, he inserted the fishing rod into the slightly damp mud, grabbed a handful of mud, and sprinkled it toward the other side of the riverbank. The mud split in the air and then suddenly grew larger, turning into countless mountain peaks and falling down with a loud rumble. The muddy river water leaped up from the ground and turned into countless water swords, thrusting toward Jingjio's face. Everything in heaven and earth could be used as a sword, and this was the all-in-one sword. The young Taoist was a strand of spiritual awareness of the immortal Chunyang, so he was no different from a replica in the pure spiritual world. His attack was the ultimate sword work of Aoyama. Jingjio took another step toward the riverbank, stepping on a wild grass. His black hair was tied up naturally, moving even though there was no wind. His white robe was fluttering, making him look like a fairy swordsman. The sand under the wild grass flew up like the gravel in a porcelain plate, turning into a stretch of mountains and rivers, blocking those mountain peaks and water swords easily. Jian Shilai also moved. This heaven and earth was his spiritual world. As soon as he willed it, heaven and earth would shake. Along with a rumbling sound, 12 tall buildings broke through the ground and formed a great formation, separating the two shores and surrounding the three of them. This was the manifestation of the sword of 12-story building in the spiritual world. Jing Shilai drew his sword, but he didn't. The young Taoist had merged with his spiritual soul, so drawing his sword against the young Taoist was equal to drawing his sword against himself. All he needed to do was to keep the young Taoist here and watch how Jing Jio would deal with him. The strong wind was howling, the muddy waves were rising, and the chilly wind was howling angrily. Countless chaotic phenomena occurred in heaven and earth. The riverbank in the distance began to collapse, making louder noises as it approached them at a high speed. Jing Jio and the young Taoist looked at each other in silence, showing no intention of leaving. The most important thing was the position. It didn't matter whether it was relative or absolute. The riverbank continued to collapse, and it soon reached the feet of the two. The young Taoist fell into the river along with the falling rocks. He looked to be in a sorry state, but the expression in his eyes was still calm, and his eyes never left Jing Jio's body. Jing Jio also fell into the river. As he was about to fall into the river, a hand reached out to him. The hand was steady and slender, very suitable for holding a sword, and it was still warm even though it hadn't been mechanically modified. When you see someone about to die, you will help. That is lending a helping hand. Jing Jio held the hand. All of a sudden, a sword sound echoed in heaven and earth, instantly suppressing the sound of the surging water. 12 tall buildings on the barren land had suddenly collapsed. The sword of 12-story building appeared in the hand. The tip of the sword pierced through Jing Jio's body. Jing Jio looked at Jian Shilai, saying nothing. "I'm sorry," Jian Shilai said. "Humans need to live." It was unclear which direction the river was flowing to. The watery mist formed by the muddy waves blocked the sky. It was unclear if there was a sun here. The sound of wind and water seemed to have disappeared at the moment. The wild grass drifted away with the waves. As the story seemed to be coming to an end, the voice of Jing Jio broke out again. "Why is the trajectory of things always the same as my prediction? It's nothing new." His voice sounded a bit tired. It was not because he was wounded or because of the betrayal, but because he felt bored. The young Taoist picked up the bamboo stick from the river and came before Jing Jio, saying, "You said by the river that morality comes from the fear of death, so you don't want others to die. You gave Jian Shilai a reason because you want freedom. However, humans need to be free from death and have the right to be free from fear. So I'm sorry, but I can't give you this freedom." Jing Jio had already guessed the truth of the matter, but he would not enter the spiritual world of Jian Shilai until his speculation was verified. Now that he had ascertained the true intention of his opponent, he didn't intend to stay here any longer, though the sword of 12-story building was still in his body. "I told you that you shouldn't have come here, but since you are here, you shouldn't leave." The bamboo stick in the young Taoist's hand turned into a horsetail whisk. As the young Taoist flicked it gently, the sky suddenly cleared up, and a red and round sun illuminated the wilderness. "All this is fake," Jing Jio said. "How can it trap me here?" It was as if his words were the law, and his will could move heaven and earth. The sun descended at a high speed, turning into a setting sun. Soon, it sank below the horizon. The cultivation state of the Federation of the Milky Way was one level higher than that of the inherited Night Empire. It was dark when one closed his eyes. One should close his eyes when it was dark. The scorching sun battleship was hovering in the space in silence. A green glow appeared in the room. Jing Jio opened his eyes and woke up in the real world. Jian Shilai's eyes were still closed. Huashi was in a corner, holding the doll in her arms. All of this happened in an instant and was not the real thing, but it could affect the reality. There was a faint but stable connection between Jing Jio's spiritual soul and Jian Shilai's. It might be due to the sword of 12-story building, or it might be due to something else. It meant that it would be difficult for him to leave this place. Even if he could find a way to do so, it would be found easily. Then he noticed something. Jian Shilai's body was glowing. There was a signal source in the deep part of his body, broadcasting the information of the coordinates to all parts of the universe. Looking at the universe outside the window, Jing Jiu sensed the approaching danger. He waved his left sleeve slightly, setting up a sword formation to protect Hua Shi in the corner. As the sword light flashed, a hint of frost appeared. It was none other than the ceiling of the 1,000 miles of ice. It was then that Jian Shilai opened his eyes. It took him 0.2 seconds to open his eyes and wake up from entering the spiritual world of Jian Shilai. It took him 0.1 second to open his eyes and finish all these actions. A pale blue light beam shot out from the dark space. The light beam hit the front part of the scorching sun battleship accurately. It was soundless. It was a shocking sight. Chapter 890. The light blue ray of light landed on the front end of the scorching sun battleship. It was still quiet in the universe, devoid of any sound. The blue ray of light started to accumulate, and its color grew fainter and fainter until it reached a milky white color. The whole process was miraculous, as if a water line had converged into a drop of water and then turned into a snowball. This was a macroscopic change. In fact, a similar change was taking place on a microscopic scale. The line had turned into a fragment. The so-called fragment was the particle. Countless hot particles formed a mass of plasma, enshrouding the room at the front of the scorching sun battleship. The plasma was a rare element heated to millions of degrees by the laser. This was the plasma cannon of the latest model. In a space war, the laser had the fastest speed and the longest destructive range, but its power would decrease with the distance, and the power couldn't be increased infinitely due to the size of the battleship. It would take some time before the laser could hit the target. Physical weapons like the nuclear bomb had a great destructive power, but their speed was too slow. The plasma cannon of the latest model could be said to be the most powerful long-range attack in the history of the Federation of the Milky Way. The first thing Jing Jiu did after obtaining the highest authority in the military of the Federation of the Milky Way was to search for the most advanced and powerful weapon system of this civilization, including the research done by the Science Academy. He was informed that the plasma cannon of this new model had been successfully developed and could be tested at any time. It was unclear whether Jing Jiu had thought that he would be the first to use this plasma cannon. The white plasma emitted a dazzling glow, bombarding the ceiling formation of 1,000-mile ice around Hua Shi. It could be seen clearly that the sword wheels with the intent of ice and frost were thinning rapidly. More plasma enveloped Jing Jiu, and the tiny and invisible high-speed particles were hitting his skin incessantly. A few strands of his black hair fell off and turned into fine black powder in the hot plasma. The blue hoodie was bombarded, and the superfine particles shrunk and then disappeared, looking like a melting crack in the space. The plasma couldn't break through his defense, but it had absorbed enough electrons. Countless tiny electric arcs were generated on the surface of Jing Jiu's body and then disappeared. The crackling sound grew fainter and fainter as the ionization of the air grew deeper and deeper. The high-temperature plasma had already started to affect his consciousness at a close distance. The scene in front of his eyes started to change. The soft chair from the hotel at the University of Stargate was gone. Only half of the iron kettle was left, and lava flowed down from the softened window. Some of the images were illusions, but most of them were reality. Everything in the room was disappearing in the high-temperature plasma, including the room itself. The scene was so incomprehensible that it felt surreal, more like a movie. Jian Shilai was also within the range of the plasma cannon. His body exuded a certain glow, which formed a barrier and blocked the high-temperature plasma outside. It could be understood that the plasma was poison, and he had taken a large amount of antidote beforehand, so he could hold on for a longer time. Even so, his situation was still somewhat miserable. The high-strength composite material kept on melting like burning plastic, revealing the alloy skeleton inside. Jing Jiu looked at a corner of the dark universe. There was a warship there. The plasma cannon was fired by that battleship. With the current technological level of the human civilization, it would take some time to store up energy if they wanted to fire such a powerful plasma cannon. The ascenders and battleships hiding in the dark were probably waiting to launch the second round of attacks. The Federation of the Milky Way hadn't completely inherited the legacy of the distant ancient civilization, so it was still able to withstand an attack of this level. If that battleship was indeed equipped with the antimatter weapon that he couldn't find no matter how hard he tried, he would have fled a long time ago. What he had to do now was to counterattack to prevent the battleship from firing the second plasma cannon, and to intimidate those ascenders hiding in the dark. But how could he counterattack? Byron and that disgraced ferryman of the West Ocean didn't dare stray too far after their ascension. It was probably because they had seen the sea of dark matter, and also because they weren't confident enough. This universe was too vast and boundless. It was bottomless to begin with. The fighting style of the cultivation practitioners couldn't adapt to such a large space. Even if one's flying sword could travel 1,000 miles in an instant, and even if one's magic treasure could flatten a small mountain, how could it threaten the battleship a few 100,000 miles away? It was because of the difference in speed and distance that the battleships in the interplanetary age used long-range weapons like the main laser cannon and the plasma cannon, and used nuclear bombs to bombard the monsters of the sea of dark matter. When one saw the laser cannon or the weapon of the particle stream, it was impossible to evade it. Nothing could travel faster than the speed of light, be it the awareness or the movement. Back when Jing Jiao was in the Haiyan Nebula, he relied on his amazing sword work and the endless fairy energy provided by thousands of nuclear bombs to smash that battleship into pieces. At the moment, Jing Jiao was bound by the plasma ball formed by the plasma cannon, and a piece of his spiritual awareness was trapped. As such, it was difficult for him to turn into a sword light and escape. As such, he couldn't use the same fighting style as last time. What else could he do? All of a sudden, a deep and low sound rang out in the Scorching Sun battleship. It was the sound of the electromagnetic equipment being activated. Hundreds of nuclear torpedoes in space left the body of the battleship, drifting toward the universe at a seemingly slow pace. Dozens of laser cannons fired a concentrated shot abruptly. The bright light illuminated a corner of the universe. Meanwhile, more weapons of the battleship were fired in that direction. They seemed to be fired aimlessly, as if they were counterattacking in a panic after being ambushed. A great many particle streams tore apart the space, and a great many physical weapons were fired slowly. It was a chaotic scene. The main laser cannons and the other weapons of the particle streams were still fine, but the collective firing of those physical weapons made the Scorching Sun battleship shake violently, and then it retreated slowly. The front end of the battleship was still within the range of the plasma cannon, soaked in the white high-temperature plasma. It was disintegrating gradually and separating from the body of the battleship. It was a smooth process, including the cross-section of the bow and the body of the battleship. Countless nuclear torpedoes and countless particle streams. The battleship that was slowly separating in a chaotic manner, and the soundless scene gave off an eerie vibe. The Scorching Sun battleship seemed to have been decapitated, or like the cutting off of the nose in the ancient punishments. The range of the plasma cannon was limited, covering only the bow of the battleship. The officers and soldiers on the Scorching Sun battleship were not affected too much, and many of them were still alive. They put on the life support equipment as quickly as possible, drifting and bumping into each other in the weightless environment, and returned to their respective posts. However, they couldn't stop the departure of the battleship. Countless gazes passed through the huge cross-section and the window and fell on the place where the Scorching Sun battleship had been. The bow of the Scorching Sun battleship was disintegrating into countless pieces, surrounded by the milky white light. It looked like a ruin that had been punished by the heavens. In the patch of bright light, the bow of the battleship had disintegrated and was on the verge of disappearing. The formation of sealing ice grew thinner and thinner, on the verge of collapsing. The ice grew more and more transparent, and the scene inside could be seen clearly. No fear could be detected on Huashi's face. She was very calm. She was still holding the doll in her bosom, and she took out a black backpack from somewhere. Looking at the location of the battleship in the deep part of the universe, Jingjiu was lost in thought. A few more black hairs fell off his head during the process. It was unclear how long he could hold on. Jingjiu raised his right hand. Seeing this, Jian Shilai's pupils shrank slightly as he sensed a great danger. It was because he didn't clench his fist tightly. His 5 fingers were clenched slightly, as if he was holding a sword. Jian Shilai was fully aware of how powerful Jingjiu was. If Jingjiu wielded his sword with all his might in a desperate situation, he wouldn't be able to withstand it. However, his mission was to keep Jingjiu here, as Jian Shilai mobilized his fairy energy and was about to bring out all the hidden weapons in his body. Jingjiu wielded his sword. Jingjiu didn't wield his sword at Jian Shilai. Instead, he wielded his sword at a spot in the universe. Those nuclear torpedoes had drifted tens of thousands of kilometers away. Those laser guns had traveled a great many kilometers away, as if they had vanished into the boundless space. Boom! Boom! The nuclear torpedoes had all exploded, turning into countless blue light balls with strong radiation, as if they had turned into sword hilts. Dozens of dissipating laser beams suddenly turned bright, turning into sharp sword lights. This was a huge sword that had never appeared in the human civilization. Jingjiu held it in his hand. The dark space in the distance was illuminated by this sword light, revealing the figure of a battleship. The battleship began to disintegrate soundlessly, as if it was being tortured to death by dismembering it. Countless corpses of the soldiers were ejected from the battleship, flying slowly into space. It was unclear where they would be buried. All the people on the battleship, regardless of whether they were the swordsmen in the Star State in the armor or the regular technical officials, had died. A dozen battleships showed up slowly from a dark corner of the space. Seeing the Scorching Sun battleship being beheaded by the plasma cannon, the people on the battleship, especially the Ascendants, were shocked and baffled. Seeing the battleship disintegrating and turning into a garbage dump at a visible speed, they were even more shocked and baffled. It was deathly quiet in the quantum communication system. It was deathly quiet in the universe. The battleship was equipped with the plasma cannon of the latest model, so it had to be equipped with the most advanced auxiliary devices, including the defense system. Neither the command ship of the Central Star Fleet, nor the private vehicles of the Ascendants, nor the battleship of the Shun Clan were as advanced as this battleship. This battleship should have activated the barrier of the gravitational field during the process of firing the first plasma cannon and accumulating energy for the second plasma cannon, but it still couldn't resist the concentrated attack of the Scorching Sun battleship. Why? Nobody could have imagined such a scenario. It was not because of their arrogant confidence, but because of the scientific spirit, which was too illogical. Is this the sword? Even though the immortal Jingyang is the most powerful swordsman in the history of Chaotian, he is still too powerful. The priest has been saying that he is the new god. Is it true? The immortal me is dead. What the hell is going on? It sounded ridiculous, but it was a bit humorous. They came to this remote and desolate patch of space for a meeting. Unexpectedly, so many things had happened before the meeting even began. Why did that battleship sneak attack the immortal Jingyang? The immortal me was the commander of the Starfront fleet, and that battleship was equipped with the plasma cannon of the latest model. Was it General Li's idea? Weren't they all members of the Aoyama sect? General Li was the great grandmaster of Jingyang. Why did they fight against each other? The sages had said that any internal strife was a foolish waste of resources before the threat of the sea of dark matter. There were no fools in the Aoyama sect. What was the purpose of all this? Chapter 891. The Scorching Sun battleship glided slowly toward the dark universe in the distance, and gradually disappeared from sight. The afterglow of the plasma cannon still lingered where the ship's bow had disappeared. The white plasma was slowly dissipating, and the 3 figures inside were getting clearer and clearer. Jingjiu looked into the distance. The black warship was disintegrating. An extremely bright sword light suddenly appeared in his eyes. Millions of kilometers away, in the debris of the warship that had turned into a garbage dump with dead bodies floating everywhere, a sword aura suddenly appeared. There was a light click, as if a match had rubbed against a piece of paper, giving birth to a flame. An explosion erupted in the warship ruins, as if a small sun was born. These were traces of a mortal energy eruption, indicating that an ascender had officially died. The flames set the wreckage ablaze. This reminded him of the scene he had seen many years ago when he first ascended. He had told Zhao Liu and Lien Sanyue about the scene. It was because he was truly shocked at the time. Tens of thousands of burning, flying swords streaked across the universe. If this was a civilization, how amazing would it be? Later on, he ascended again and entered this civilization. When he found out that those burning flying swords were actually battleships, he had long since become indifferent. Everything was his sword. Battleships were also swords. Killing Daoist Qisong back then was a little difficult because Daoist Qisong's realm was too high, and he was not used to fighting in such a vast universe. Therefore, he needed the immortal qi provided by the nuclear bomb as a source of energy. Through his studies in the 857 base and his calculations in the storeroom of the Scorching Sun battleship, he had finally found his own sword work in this universe. In other words, he had left his sword work in this universe. He turned all the weapons in the warship into his own sword, and then condensed them into one. He knew who the ascender he killed was. When General Li met him in a museum of modern art on the Antarctic ice sheet, there were 3 ascendants secretly preparing. If the two sides did not reach an agreement, there would be a war. At that time, Saint Singju was playing games in the laboratory of the Alliance Academy of Science. The stone man of Mount Chun Wu was hidden at the bottom of the planet's crater. There was also a person on the battleship who was ready to press a red button at any time. Now that he thought about it, the red button activated the plasma cannon. Master Mi was the first-generation ascender of Dongyi Dao. His realm was very high, and his strength was very strong. Well, he flew back to the ice. Under the afterglow of the plasma, the hexahedron of ice looked like a perfect diamond, sparkling. The 1,000-mile ice ceiling formation was indeed the most powerful formation that Taiping Zhenren had mastered, as it had been able to imprison Taiping Zhenren in the sword jail for hundreds of years. It had not been broken under the bombardment of the plasma cannons, but had become much thinner. Hua, she floated over and looked at him in silence through the transparent ice. He dipped his hand into the ice. Hua, she hung the black backpack on his hand. He took out the black backpack, put on the clothes, and fastened the nuclear power furnace. He was about to turn around and kill Jian Shilai. It was true that he had no way of controlling things millions of kilometers away. There were many ascenders in those battleships, and there was also an aura that he did not like, the smell of the gravitational field. He had to leave. A part of his spiritual awareness was still in the spiritual world of Jian Shilai. If he wished to leave this place without leaving any trouble, it was the simplest way to do so. Jian Shilai knew what he was going to do. He closed his eyes calmly. Of course, he wasn't going to stretch out his neck to be chopped off. In the next moment, he opened his eyes. Jing Jiu saw the sparks of the plasma in his eyes, the wilderness and the sparks, the river and the people on both sides of the river. The sword of 12-story building was still in his body. One could pick up the stars from a tall building, and one could kill the fairies with a horizontal move. On the other side of the river, the young Taoist priest was gliding over. His red Taoist robe was very eye-catching. A glow suddenly appeared in the real universe, and the scattered particles were ejected backward, looking like a tail or a comet. It was the glow of the nuclear power furnace. A streak of red appeared in the dark universe. It was the red cloak. The embers of the plasma cannons had gradually dissipated, and the flames of the burning battleship in the distance had also died out. The permanent star in the galaxy beyond the fog emitted a faint glow, illuminating the hexahedron of ice and Huaxi's face. Looking out from the ice with one's back to the permanent star, the universe was so dark and deathly silent that it looked like a graveyard, but it was more empty and desolate than any graveyard. As a result, it made one feel even more helpless and sad. The little girl tilted her head and looked at Jing Jiao, General Li, and Jian Shalai, seeming to be observing something with a puzzled expression. This was indeed a puzzling matter. It seemed that some misunderstandings between Jing Jiao and General Li had been resolved after their meeting on the ice sheet in the South Pole. As a result, the trip to the 857 base was possible. Why did the two sides suddenly break up again? Everything needed a reason. Even if it was a gang fight between two sects in the Jianghu, it had to be because of a shop or the right to fish. For figures like them, what kind of things could cause a dispute? Was it because Jian Shilai was imprinted with an ideological brand? Was it because Jing Jiao didn't want to accept the style of the Aoyama sect? Was it because of the conflict of ideas? No, it was not that simple. The Aoyama sect had never cared about freedom and equality, not to mention Jing Jiao. Jian Shilai didn't respond. He knew the inside story. The ascenders on the battleships remained silent. The entire universe was waiting for the answer to be revealed. I told you by the river that humans need to survive, so I can't give you freedom. That means you can leave at any time. General Li looked at Jing Jiao and said, "Because you are the only hope of mankind." What did that mean? Why was Jing Jiao the only hope of mankind? Was it because his cultivation had embarked on a completely different path? Or was it evolution? Was it because his computing power could help humans figure out the star-igniting plan? Jian Shilai said earnestly while staring into his eyes, "You are the weapon left by the distant ancient civilization. Only you can ignite the permanent star and wipe out the sea of dark matter." The quantum communication system between the battleships was silent. There was not even any background noise. The universe was also quiet. The ascenders and the universe were shocked speechless by this answer. The weapon of the permanent star level was a weapon that could utilize the energy of the whole permanent star or destroy it. The star-igniting plan was the most practical method to wipe out the sea of dark matter, because the god of the distant ancient civilization had succeeded in doing so. However, there were two unsolvable problems: how to ignite the permanent stars, and what kind of weapon should be used to ignite the permanent stars. There was a rumor in the Federation of the Milky Way that the military had already developed the weapon a long time ago, but this rumor was false. Jing Jiao had asked Xinyan Mai what kind of weapon it was after seeing the dreadful scene on the surface of the 857 planet. He had asked Xingju what kind of weapon it was when he saw the patch of starry sky under the 857 planet and heard about the star-igniting plan for the first time. He had asked Hua Shi the same question. He had asked himself the same question in the storage room of the Scorching Sun battleship when he was faced with hundreds of millions of black and white go pieces. Many people had searched for the answer, and it turned out that he was the answer. Dozens of ascendants stood by the windows of the battleship, stunned speechless while looking at the asteroid belt in the distance where the residual plasma glows were still visible. After learning that the immortal Jingyang had ascended and come to the Federation of the Milky Way, they all went to read the book titled The Path Toward Heaven. A few of them were even loyal users of the game. It was stated clearly in the book that the immortal Jingyang was an unparalleled genius who had been reborn as a sword, and his body was the most powerful fairy sword of the Aoyama sect. Unexpectedly, the all-in-one sword was a weapon left by a god of the previous generation that could ignite the permanent stars. Jing Jiao was quite calm. It was because he had vaguely guessed or predicted this, and he had heard what the young Taoists said in the spiritual world of Jian Shilai. If they wished to carry out the plan to ignite the permanent stars and wipe out the sea of dark matter, General Li and the human civilization had to hold him in their hands. In a sense, no. In other senses, he was indeed the hope of the humans. In history, those who had been placed such a high hope on had no freedom. It was because it was the responsibility of the hope of the humans. But was he willing to bear this responsibility? If the humans need you to sacrifice yourself one day, will you be willing to do so? Asked General Li while looking at him. It seemed that the entire human race was asking him this question. Of course not, replied Jing Jiao without any hesitation or mental struggle. Since he was a man of few words, he added the word of course to express his attitude. General Li knew the answer. This was the origin of today's war. "If I were you, you wouldn't let me go either," said Jian Shilai. "Nonsense," snapped Jing Jiao. It was true that it was nonsense in his eyes. If Jian Shilai were the weapon of the permanent star state that could avert the catastrophe of the humans, he wouldn't let Jian Shilai go. Yet the problem was that the weapon was him, not somebody else. Jian Shilai said, "If I were you, I would be willing to sacrifice myself for the humans." "So would I," said General Li calmly. Many of the ascendants on the battleships would choose to sacrifice themselves for the human civilization. It was because it was the most magnificent cause, and it was a great act that could make one a god. I can understand and appreciate the fact that the lives that are destined to end prematurely for the sake of some beautiful things, but I won't accept it. Jing Jiao made his declaration to the whole universe while looking at those battleships and the permanent stars in the distance. It's because my existence is more magnificent than any other cause. End of this chapter. Chapter 892. It was unclear if it was because the high-temperature particles were too active, but Jing Jiao's voice sounded a bit special. It was as bright as a sword, cutting open the cold space with its sharpness. It traveled far and fast in the universe devoid of any medium in a peculiar way. Hearing the deafening declaration in the communication system, the ascendants fell silent for a while. Then they heard the echoes of the voice outside the window. The cultivation practitioners who could ascend must be extremely intelligent and have a firm Tao heart. Some of them might agree with Jing Jiao's idea when they were still in Chaotian, but after they came to this universe and learned enough about astronomy and physics, they knew the end of time. As a result, they couldn't help but feel empty and have a different idea. Of course, they might have been influenced by some of the predecessors who had ascended. In a short time, they had made up their minds that they would try their best to prevent Jing Jiao from leaving. A dozen battleships showed up in different parts of the universe, separated from each other by a few million to a few 100 million kilometers. Though they seemed to appear randomly, they were actually connected to each other, forming a formation, or in other words, a net. The center of this invisible net was the asteroid belt in the outer part of the galaxy beyond the foggy galaxy, or more precisely, the location where the scorching sun battleship had been. In the book, you destroyed my Aoyama sword formation. What do you think of my Aoyama sword formation? Asked General Li. It was true that the dozen battleships and the gravitational field that Jing Jiao didn't like formed a formation when they were connected together. If the all-in-one sword he used to kill the immortal me and destroy that battleship was a large sword of the universe, then this formation was a large formation of the universe. "Very weak," remarked Jing Jiao. General Li said to him with a faint smile, "Most of the ascendants in Chaotian over the last tens of thousands of years have gathered here today. Do you think you can leave? The battleships are everywhere, and the ferrymen are as numerous as dogs." Looking at the approaching battleships and thinking of the ascendants on the battleships, Jing Jiao remarked expressionlessly, "But they are merely a bunch of dogs. How can they keep me here?" He wasn't trying to be arrogant. It was the word dogs that he emphasized. This word directly tore apart the cloak of warmth and the great cause of mankind between the two parties, revealing the most naked truth. If Jian Shilai had indeed been imprinted with the thought of the Aoyama sect, and that was why he was so obedient, what about the other ascendants present? Jing Jiao raised his right hand. Countless sword intents pierced through the air. General Li and Jian Shilai also raised their right hands. The sword wills met in the universe without any sound, except for a few gloomy sword glows. Compared to the vast universe, these sword lights were too small and soon disappeared without a trace. The moment the sword light disappeared, 3 small suns were ignited one after another. It was the light emitted by the nuclear power furnace. Jing Jiao's nuclear furnace was tied to his waist, and General Li's nuclear furnace was hidden in his red cloak, but Jian Shilai's furnace was installed in his body. Previously, when he wanted to self-detonate to keep Jing Jiao alive, he was relying on this point. The three rays of light crisscrossed on the dark cosmic curtain, drawing an extremely complicated pattern, and then returned to the starting point. Thousands of meteorites in the nearby asteroid belt broke into pieces soundlessly, their shapes looking even more hideous, like the skulls in hell. General Li's red cloak had a few more tears. Jin Shilai's neck had a deep cut. If his body hadn't been modified, he would have lost the ability to fight even though he had a fairy body. A few strands of black hair drifted to the ice cube on the hexahedron and spread out like dandelions after touching it lightly. Huashi gazed at the strands of black hair through the seemingly thin surface of the ice, a pensive expression showing in her eyes. The plasma cannon had wounded Jingjiao. General Li's cultivation state was not lower than Jingjiao's, and Jian Shilai was also very powerful. More importantly, a dozen black battleships were approaching. This Aoyama sword formation, formed by the gravitational field, was descending, and the fishing net was tightening. A shallow crack suddenly appeared on the surface of the ice. It was not because of the strands of black hair, but because the gravitational field had arrived. More terrifyingly, the gravitational field carried the formidable spiritual awareness of the ascendants. Over the last tens of thousands of years, the human ascendants in Chaotian were more than what was recorded in the historical records. More than half of them had arrived here that day. These ascendants looked ordinary, but they were not ordinary at all. They were the true fairy men, and each of them possessed an unimaginable fighting prowess. Killing the immortal Qi Song and killing the immortal Mi had consumed a great deal of his sword's source and mental energy. How could he deal with so many ascendants? In essence, he was facing the entire cultivation history of Chaotian. No one could do it, not even if he was a god. An unimaginable energy approached from all over the universe. It could be said that this was the most powerful energy since the beginning of heaven and earth. The snow girl at her peak was not as powerful as it was at the moment. Even the highest-ranked brood mother wouldn't be able to withstand such pressure and would wither at a visible rate. The light rays of the distant permanent star began to twist. More and more cracks appeared on the surface of the hexahedron, and the refracted light rays became more and more peculiar. The light rays were suddenly dyed red. It was because Huashi couldn't withstand the energy of the 1,000-mile frozen sword formation and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Jingjiao's face was pale, his black hair tousling without the aid of the wind, a few strands falling off from time to time. "You'll die," said General Li. Jingjiao said, "I'll never die." General Li said, "It's true that your body can't be destroyed, but what about your spiritual soul?" No sooner had he said this than the fog of the Scorpion Tail Nebula was suddenly illuminated. More than 10,000 battleships of the Star Vanguard fleet passed through the twisted passage one after another and broke through the interstellar dust. They came to this side of the universe and aimed their heavy and long-range weapons at Jingjiao. If he were truly in an immortal state, why would he stay in this universe? Would his spiritual soul vanish in next moment? If you're truly merciless, why did you meet me by the river? You can ignore Shen Yunmai and Jian Shilai. Just accept it. By then, the whole of mankind will benefit, and the whole world will thank you for your teachings, and the things that belong to you will be spread to the masses. You'll be like a comet on the verge of perishing, radiating brilliance in all directions. The infinite light will be connected to your light forever. This was the last announcement made by General Li and the whole human race. This is a long speech, but I've written a book with more words. I used 2 million words to tell the world that I won't accept it. Why do you still bother me? Jingjiao went on. As for why I did what I did, you've thought too much about it. I was willing to step into the river because I was prepared for it. What was your preparation? Asked General Li. What kind of preparation could help Jingjiao overcome the current crisis? What kind of preparation could help him face the history of Chaotian or even the entire human civilization? He turned to look at the ice cube with a hexagonal shape. Huashi was wiping the blood from her nose in the ice cube, her expression innocent and bewildered. It seemed that she had no idea what had just happened. Jing Jiu fixed his line of sight on her face through the ice, asking, "Can you trust me now?" After a moment of silence, she wiped the blood on her hand on her skirt and said while lifting her head to look at Jing Jiu, "I haven't figured it out from the very beginning. How did you recognize me?" Jing Jiu said, "You took the wine cup when we were drinking by the hot spring. The fingerprints on it were the same as Hua Xi's." Hua Xi said with a smile, "Oh, I see. It looks like one shouldn't be too lazy." "It's not laziness," said Jing Jiu. "It's a habit." Hua Xi was the daughter of a well-known clan on the Stargate base. That clan had a distant relationship with the Hua clan on the main planet. It was the same in the files of all the forces in the Federation of the Milky Way. She had an ordinary talent, an ordinary and lovely temperament, and an ordinary and good-looking appearance. She was like those girls in the comics and games. For many people, it was the most remarkable thing in her life to become the personal attendant of Zhong Lizi and go to the College of Priests on the main planet. Many people were puzzled that Jing Jiu chose to take her with him instead of Zhong Lizi and Jiang Yuxia when he left the main planet. It wasn't until today that the answer was revealed. Did the female priest of the Stargate think that Jing Jiu was the new god and would be of great help to him simply because of the gold coins stolen from the owner of the gaming parlor in the underground neighborhood? Of course, it was not that simple. It was because of Hua Xi. She was that one. In other words, she was the replica of that one. The last few words generally said to Jing Jiu were Goethe's morning speech for Schiller. They were used at Einstein's funeral. I mentioned it in the postscript of the death of Qing Yu, and it was also for Yi Qing Mei. Chapter 893. Jing Jiu was a lazy person, but he was very observant. He spent most of his time resting with his eyes closed, no matter if he was on the bamboo chair or the soft chair. When he opened his eyes once in a while, he could see the whole world clearly. This was probably what it meant to look at the world coldly. It was the clearest. Back when they were by the hot spring, the young woman in the bathrobe, who called herself Fei, invited him to drink wine. He didn't drink, but he glanced at her wine cup. Her fingerprint was left on the ceramic cup. It was a strange thing for a cyborg to have a fingerprint. He memorized the fingerprint and found a similar one in his awareness. Of course, the fingerprints of the clones couldn't be exactly the same because they grew up in different environments, but there was a rule among them. The fingerprint belonged to Hua Xi. Having ascertained this fact, many questions had been answered. After Jing Jiu led Zhong Lizi out of the underground and headed for Shou City, they attracted the attention of many people. The Ascender organization, represented by General Li, used a crude method of inspection. The priests adopted a much gentler method, which was more appropriate to be called observation. Why did the female priest of the Stargate think he was the new god? It was impossible for it to be because of the owner of the gaming parlor or the Twirling Rain Gaming Company. It was impossible for a true, zealous believer to sit in front of the basin of water and the 3 flower petals for more than 10 years. It must be someone she trusted who made her believe in the identity of Jing Jiu. In the whole of the Federation of the Milky Way, that person was the only one who could do it. That person had a supreme status in the minds of the priests and the believers. Nobody would question her decision. What puzzled Jing Jiu was why that person chose a human like Hua when she could have arranged for her doppelgangers to be the female priest on various administrative planets to pass on the distant ancient civilization at a faster speed. It might be because of the historical reasons, or because she was restricted by a certain rule. He would think about it later. Right now, he had to solve the problem at hand. In addition to the transparent 6-sided ice cube, he also saw the stars in the sky and the fleet that looked like the stars. He didn't care about those battleships, but those ascendants. Then, he spun his head and saw General Li in Jianshilai. How could he defeat all of Chaotian? He had to rely on the whole of the Federation of the Milky Way. Looking at the little girl in the transparent ice cube, the expression in General Li's eyes changed slightly, showing a hint of surprise. He was the commander of the Alliance Army and the leader of the Cocoon Breakers, but there were still some things he did not know. The military had investigated Hua Xi's identity. Who would have thought that this seemingly ordinary little girl was actually that person's clone? He bowed to Huashi. Dozens of sword lights and magical treasures illuminated the dark universe. The ascendants left their respective warships and bowed to the little girl in the ice according to the customs of their respective sects and eras. They all knew that it was not a real human, but an artificial intelligence left behind by an ancient civilization. After the distant ancient civilization and the sea of dark matter perished together, this patch of the starry sky was desolate and deathly still. Because of her existence, flowers could be reborn in this desolate and silent starry sky, and human civilization could be revived. It was no exaggeration to say that she was the true savior, the beacon that illuminated the future of mankind. That God could be said to be the creator of Chaotian, regardless of whether it was the laboratory or the last refuge of the humans, and she was the spokesperson of that God. Even if she was just a clone of her, she was still worthy of the most sincere respect. The most important issue at the moment was, which side would she take between the ascendants of Chaotian and Jingjiu? This question had been answered a long time ago. The ascendants from Chaotian had been living in the shadow of this civilization for many years, and they had an irresistible force. The government of the Federation of the Milky Way, the Ran family, the Hua family, and the other clans had all relied on her unparalleled reputation to maintain their existence. These forces loyal to her had never had a good relationship with the ascendants. It could even be said that they had a bad relationship. It's your business. I'm merely an observer. Huashi's voice came out through the thin ice, and then vanished instantly, sounding very feeble. Judging from this, she was indeed a regular human, but her big eyes were devoid of the naivety of a little girl. They were calm and indifferent, as if she had no interest in this conflict. Jingjiu was fully aware that she was not telling the truth. No matter whether she was the beacon of the human civilization or the spokesperson of that God, she would make her stance clear. He believed that she would stand on his side. Chaotian might be a laboratory designed by that God, but the ascendants who had come out from this laboratory had taken a completely different path from those in the Federation of the Milky Way, and they were much more powerful than she had imagined. The confrontation caused by the history couldn't be resolved in a short time. The ascendants, represented by the Grandmasters of Aoyama, had put too much pressure on her. She needed external help, which was why she had stayed by his side for such a long time. "You've been observing me for a long time," said Jingjiu. She had observed him through the priests of the Stargate base for a long time when they were on the Stargate base. She began to observe him directly during the selection of the priests. Then it was the space voyage to the main planet. She saw him destroy the battleship and kill the immortal Chi Song. Then it was the conversation by the hot spring. Jingjiu took her with him when they left the main planet, in order to give her enough time to observe herself. He went to the 857 base, the Huangyu number 3 planet, the sea of dark matter, and the storeroom of the Scorching Sun battleship full of black and white chess pieces. "You know I've been to the sun. You know what I'm calculating and that I can achieve it." Jingjiu continued while looking at the little girl in the ice cube. "More importantly, you know what kind of person I am. Why did that person want to form an alliance with him? It was because he was powerful enough to change the situation of the humans. And, in a sense, he and she were the same kind of person. The burning fleet was arriving in this patch of the universe. Dozens of flying swords and magic treasures illuminated the galaxy outside the fog. They didn't have much time left. Huashi said to Jingjiu in silence, "I can't perform physical operations." This question had arisen many times. She had given an accurate answer when she picked up the teacup the other day. "Give me the right of access," said Jingjiu. That person could control the entire Federation of the Milky Way through the ubiquitous network, but she could only perform a limited physical operation due to a certain rule. Yet, she could give the right of access to Jingjiu and let him control the entire Federation of the Milky Way through her, including the Stardip fleet that was about to arrive in this patch of the universe. Not just anyone could do this, because it required extremely powerful mental strength, and most importantly, it required her complete trust. Only one person had obtained such a right of access in the long history of the universe, which was that deity. Huashi took out a ring from somewhere and asked while looking at Jingzhou's eyes, "If you accept it, you will become a new deity and take on the responsibilities of the humans. Are you sure you won't regret it?" The ring seemed to be made of gold, with some fine gems embedded on it. It had a certain energy fluctuation, indicating that it was definitely not an ordinary item. "I'm willing," said Jingzhou. It was evident that the ring was an access device with the highest right of access to the entire network of the universe. But somehow, Jingzhou had a different feeling at the moment. Having said that, Jingzhou put his right hand into the ice cube. Huashi put the ring on his finger. Jingzhou's awareness entered a vast, illusory world, which was comparable to the real universe, and he sensed endless information. He looked at the universe, and what he saw was different. In addition to the real permanent stars, there were many tiny light specks in the starry sky, which were denser than the stars and moving faster, forming a complicated pattern. The glowing chips and terminals of data processing were the glowing chips. The light screens, computers, devices, glasses, gaming cabins, artificial eyes, brainwave processors, automatic sweeping robots, cyborgs, mechas, battleships, everything that could be imagined with information was in this world. This patch of starry sky was the human civilization. Right now, everything was in his eyes and in his consciousness. The battleships of the Central Star Fleet were flying toward him at a high speed, looking like 10,000 burning flying swords. Jingzhou looked in that direction. Those battleships began to decelerate slowly and then changed their direction. Countless laser guns were aimed at General Li, Jian Shilai, those ascendants, and their battleships. The entire scene looked like a religious movie. The most powerful force in Chaotian and the central computer of the Federation of the Milky Way were like deities. This was a divine miracle. Jian Shilai fell silent while looking at the scene. The ascendants fell silent as well. It was then that General Li let out a sigh. The sigh sounded sentimental and relaxed, as if he had resolved the matter that had been weighing on his mind for many years. It was quiet in the passageway of the 857 base. The alloy wall by the window was still smooth, devoid of any marks. The researchers were still doing their research in the lab, so nobody noticed that Professor Long had disappeared a few days ago, along with that cyborg officer. There was a blue planet a great many light years away. A peculiar disc-shaped spaceship landed slowly on the surface of the ocean, creating countless sprays. An old man with a broad forehead walked out from the spaceship as the door of the spaceship was opened. Looking at the boundless ocean, he let out a complicated sigh. The cyborg's officer walked out from the spaceship as well. The old man was none other than Professor Long, the immortal Tan, the sect master of the Zhongzhou school in Chaotian. Looking at the small island in the ocean, he remarked sentimentally, "You don't fear death because you don't have intelligence. Why am I so crazy?" There was a hot spring on the island, filled with hot fog. A gust of wind blew over once in a while, blowing away the fog, exposing the scene by the pool. An old man wearing a conical hat sat on a rock by the hot spring. He was short and skinny, looking lifeless. The young woman sat on the opposite side, still wearing the bathrobe, her black fringe tousling slightly, but the wine in the ceramic cup in her hand was as calm as a mirror. A go board was placed between the old man and the young woman, on which the black and white go pieces were placed. This game of Go was not as complicated as the one played by Jingzhou on the Scorching Sun battleship. In fact, it was many times simpler than a regular Go game. It was because they were playing 5 in a row. The old man picked up a black Go piece with his skinny finger and placed it on the Go board gently. "Time's up. Let's restart the game," he said. Chapter 894. Jingzhou's awareness extended to all parts of the universe along the interplanetary network at an unimaginably fast speed. First, he controlled the entire Star Vanguard fleet. In the next moment, he planned to control the space hub of the Scorpion Tail Nebula and control the supply of resources to the Federation of the Milky Way. Next, he planned to enter the top-secret database of the military to find the code of the defense system of the ancestral planet and kill someone for the immortal Tan. In the end, he planned to control the entire Federation of the Milky Way and ask General Li and the other ascendants to surrender. This was his plan. Jingjiu had thought about it with his eyes closed for many days in the scorching sun battleship while facing the go pieces all over the sky. As for how to ignite those permanent stars, he had merely thought about it in the beginning. There were still 300 years to go, so there was no need to hurry. Theoretically, this plan was not a problem. It was because General Li had no idea that she was the replica of that person. Yet, everything in the world corresponded to each other. There was no such thing as observing someone, and no such thing as controlling something. Even if one merely glanced at someone, many photons would fall into one's eyes. When one uses awareness to control a device or a chip, the corresponding data would come back to one's awareness. Back when he connected to the interplanetary network in the library of the Shershin Institute under the Stargate for the first time, it was overloaded because the amount of data he downloaded was too large. He was in the universe now, and he was using the long-distance wireless transmission. Theoretically, as long as his spiritual world could withstand it, there was no upper limit to the speed of downloading or communicating. The ring was neither a real information node nor a data bridge. It was more like a digital label. As his awareness spread to all parts of the universe, a great deal of information came from all over the universe and entered his spiritual world. This was not a problem, nor was it dangerous. He was not a regular human, and his spiritual world was as deep as the ocean, and he could stop the process at any time if he wanted to. Stop. When he thought of this word, he had actually given an order with his awareness, but he didn't stop. A great deal of data kept coming from all over the universe, flooding into his brain like the tide and entering his spiritual world. Most of the data had nothing to do with the exploration of his awareness. They were meaningless pieces of information. All kinds of images, all kinds of characters flashed in his consciousness and then sank into the sea. The peaceful ocean in his spiritual world started to ripple, and the ripples grew larger and larger. His temples started to swell like those of a regular human. Feeling the torrent of information, Jingjiu understood something. During the selection of the female priest of the Stargate, the scorching sun battleship had fired its main laser cannons toward the ground. Jingjiu dodged those lasers and flew to the space to open the body of the scorching sun battleship, preparing to take control of this battleship through the network. At that moment, a faint sigh echoed from the depths of that seemingly real, dark data channel. That sigh seemed to come from the bottom of a well, carrying with it an extremely deep chill, giving off an extremely cold feeling. He immediately turned around and left, because he felt that this person was an existence that could threaten him. These 3 sentences are copied from the previous one. When he saw the girl in the bathrobe by the hot spring, he knew that she was that existence. He trusted her because the priests and the ascendants were enemies, and more importantly, he thought they were the same kind of people. Back in Chaotian, Qing, and Ping Yongka were his staunchest allies. But why would she be an exception? Of course, this choice was risky. In order to minimize the risk, he led her away from the main planet and traveled around, in an attempt to convince her and himself. It wasn't until he saw the sunny Jianshilai and received the magic crane he left for Shinyinmai a few days ago that he had finally made up his mind due to the pressure from the other side. He poured a cup of tea for her and put on the ring. He had done all that he could, but it was a pity that things had become boring and repetitive again. Jingjiu said to the repetition doesn't suit your level. The repetition referred to the method. He entered Jian Shilai's spiritual world, but he was sneak attacked and a spiritual awareness was left in it. Now that he had opened up his Tao heart and connected to the interplanetary network without any obstruction, he had entered her spiritual world and was sneak attacked again. This time, the target of the attack was his spiritual soul. Huashi said, "I know the humans very well. Your nature is the repetition." Jingjiu said, "I thought you would think we were the same kind of people." "Not yet," said Huashi calmly. During the brief conversation, the information from all over the universe kept pouring in like a violent torrent. It was hard to describe the quantity of the information. Even the storage equipment of the highest state in the Science Academy of the Federation would be filled up in a few milliseconds. The information was not carefully selected. Some of them were words, some were pictures, and some were videos. But most of them were disordered pieces that couldn't be arranged properly, occupying more space than the others. They were like the broken stones, the turbulent torrents, the collapsing mountains in the air, the broken planets, and the red giant stars. All of them kept coming in. It could be understood that the data of the entire human civilization was bombarding his Tao heart in an attempt to destroy his consciousness. Jingjiu felt a bit dizzy, similar to the feeling Shen Yunmai had after he took the medicine. It was probably because of this that he didn't notice some crucial data hidden in the seemingly chaotic torrent of information. Huashi looked at him through the thin layer of ice. There was no emotion in her eyes. Seeing the scene, Jian Shilai remained silent. The sword of the 12-story building was moving outward slowly. The young Taoist monk's Taoist robe was still as red as before. The red overcoat was so eye-catching in the dark space. He flew back to General Li. General Li said to Jingjiu, "You're indeed the strongest cultivation practitioner in Chaotian, but you're not a human being, but a weapon." Jingjiu had heard of this statement or something similar. It was said by his big brother Taiping through Opiao when a meeting was held on the Tianguang Peak many years ago. Many people said that he was a sword devil and was not qualified to be the sect master of Aoyama, so he should leave. However, it was evident that neither General Li nor Hua she would let him leave. "I'm nobody's weapon. I'm myself." Jingjiu continued while looking at Hua. "Do you think you could disperse my consciousness with these data? These data are used to format and overlay your brain." Huashi went on, "After that, I'll have to write a new program to control you." "Nothing can control me," said Jingjiu. Having said that, his gaze fell on the ring, countless bright sword lights appearing in the deep end of his eyes. In the next moment, he clenched his hand so hard that the ring on his finger began to twist and deform slightly. He had no way to stop the data of the human civilization from rushing into his ocean of consciousness. It was because the information was flowing too fast and the door couldn't be closed. As such, destroying the ring as the data channel should solve some of the problem. More importantly, he could vaguely sense that this ring had a deeper meaning, which could pose a threat to him. Since the other party intended to trap him in this way, this ring must be an extraordinary object. The gems on the surface of the ring broke into pieces one after another, shooting out powders that looked like crystal raindrops. At the same time, a great deal of powerful energy emerged. The broken gems turned out to be the most advanced formations of Taoist sections. What was more impressive was that there were devices similar to the gravitational field under the formations. The formations of Taoist sects were exceedingly powerful, and each of them was as powerful as the great formation of Cloud Dream Mountain. It could be said that they were the best in the cultivation circle of Chaotian. The miniature gravitational devices were even more incredible, far superior to the technology of the Federation of the Milky Way. A thin space separated Jingjiu's finger from the ring, so that his sword wills and energy couldn't land on the ring. The ring was indeed the product of two civilizations, and it could block the all in one sword. There was a similar product of civilization in this world, which was Shen Yunmai. Even Shen Yunmai was not his match in the end. How long could this ring last? As soon as the countless white lights came out, they were bound by the sword wills on his finger and shattered into nothingness. This was the most powerful sword he had ever wielded. The formidable sword wills spread to all parts of the space, and a great many meteorites in the asteroid belt were shattered instantly. General Li and Jian Shilai turned into two sword lights and retreated to a place thousands of miles away. The formations on the surface of the ring were broken one after another, and the space between them grew thinner. Looking at the broken gems floating in the space, she displayed a regretful expression in her eyes. A moment before the ring was completely destroyed, a thin green light suddenly appeared on Jingjiu's wrist and tightened automatically. The green light was not a real object, and it was not even a real light. It was the projection of a certain information wave, or, in other words, the external display of a program. The whole universe seemed to hear a sword sound. It was not the flying sword breaking through the air. It was the sheath. The gems and the formations on the surface of the ring were stabilized again. The torrent of information from the human civilization grew more violent. The key data hidden in the torrent of information were revealed, and they had their own connections and rules. It turned out to be a program. The program had locked his awareness and was in the process of rewriting the code. This was the cleanest way of restarting the system, or in other words, restoring the factory settings. This ring is not the inherited heaven sword, it's the program. An aged and distant voice rang out in this patch of the universe, echoing in everyone's mind. A huge figure appeared amid the stars in the sky. It was a short and thin old man wearing a conical hat. His face was hidden in the shadows, so it was hard to see him clearly. He was not a real person, but a projection of the spiritual awareness in the real world, like the green light on Jingjiu's hand. All the ascendants bowed to the old man reverently. The Grand Master of Aoyama, the Shun of Aoyama. Jingjiu looked at him, saying nothing. You destroyed the inherited heaven sword by all means in Chaotian, thinking that you would be free after that. But you forgot that it was me who made this sword. The Grand Master of Aoyama continued while looking at him. You destroyed one sword, so I'll make another one. Jingjiu remained silent while sensing the weight of the green light on his wrist, which was as heavy as heaven and earth. Don't try to stop it from happening. It's meaningless even if you don't admit that you are the weapon left by God. The Grand Master of Aoyama continued while looking at him. It's because, all in one, you are my sword. Chapter 895. Many years ago, Chaotian was still in the barbaric era. Volcanoes often erupted, seas often roared, rivers often overflowed, and spiritual energy was dispersed in the abyss, but it was still slowly rising. The fog covered the sky, and the earth was dark. The cracked earth was exactly the same as the back of a certain divine beast. Suddenly, a shooting star streaked across the night sky and landed somewhere in the southern continent. After an unknown number of years, the place where the meteor entered gradually bulged and became a lonely peak. There weren't any creatures on the mountain peak, not even a single plant. It was because the entire place was filled with a sharp cutting intent. With the passage of time, the continent gradually calmed down. The airflow became stable, the rain became regular, the earth became moist, and all living things grew. A young woodcutter with the surname Shun stumbled into the deep mountains and picked up a demon sword. He comprehended the laws of heaven and earth and attained the Tao in a single day. He was inspired by the lush greenery of the mountains and used this as his title, calling himself the Junren of Aoyama. Behind him, the sword gradually gained a true spirit and was about to leave. The true master of Aoyama had created a scabbard to restrain his soul, depriving him of freedom. The scabbard was named Sky-Bearing, and the sword was named All-in-One. The enlightened master of Aoyama wielded the All-in-One sword, sweeping across the world and creating the number one sword sect in the world. This was the origin of the Aoyama sect. He was the founder of Aoyama. The founder of Aoyama was the first human to ascend. For some reason, he didn't bring the All-in-One sword with him when he left Chaotian. In other words, he couldn't bring the All-in-One sword with him. After that, every faction leader of Aoyama would wield the sheath of the inherited heaven sword to control the All-in-One sword. Only by doing so would they be qualified to be the faction leader. Many years ago, with the sudden deaths of the immortal Daoyuan and the immortal Qinzhou, All-in-One swords suddenly disappeared from the mountains of Aoyama. Taiping Jinren and the dead dog had searched for him secretly for many years, but they didn't find him. No one knew that the young Taoist priest named Jingyang had a new playmate. That playmate was sometimes a mushroom, sometimes a stone, sometimes a monkey, sometimes a sword. However, no matter what, the Grand Master of Aoyama was definitely the one who was most qualified to say that. All in one, you are my sword. When the Grand Masters of Aoyama ascended to the outside universe, the Federation of the Milky Way was still in its initial stage, and the human civilization hadn't recovered completely. He might have known all the secrets from the very beginning, or he learned the truth after he came to this world. All in all, he knew that his sword was the only weapon capable of igniting the permanent star and wiping out the sea of dark matter. He guarded the humans in silence, waiting for the sword to arrive. Many years had passed, and the human civilization had developed at a high speed again. That sword had finally ascended and left Chaotian, but it was no longer the same sword. More importantly, the sword had successfully destroyed the Sky Mandate Sword during a civil war in Aoyama's sect. Hence, the Grand Master of Aoyama forged a new version of the inherited Heaven Sword. Both the departure of Shun Yunmai and the torrential river in Jianxilei's awareness were intended to exert pressure on Jingjiu and push him to the side of the female priest. When Jingjiu intended to control this world would control him in turn. Even though he was strong enough to resist this world for a while, he still couldn't stop the program from entering his awareness with an unimaginably large amount of information, wiping out his independent awareness and regaining control of his body. So how did it all start? The hexagonal ice block refracted the light of the distant permanent star. There were more stars in the universe. The spiritual awareness of the Grand Master of Aoyama was projected among them, looking at Jingjiu in silence. Tens of thousands of battleships had gotten rid of the control and were heading toward him along with the ascendants, looking like countless burning flying swords. Many days ago, Jingjiu killed the mother of the high estate, but he was wounded severely because he underestimated her callous will and her desire to die. Considering the distance between him and the sun at the time, it would take him many years to recover from his wounds. Taiping Jinren turned into a band of green smoke and pushed Jingjiu closer to the sun, shortening the time for Jingjiu to recover to a few hundred seconds, and then he himself had only a few seconds left. At the last moment, they saw tens of thousands of burning, flying swords. Those burning flying swords turned into battleships as soon as they stopped. As the ubiquitous surveillance network discovered the abnormal energy movement in this part of the universe, the Starpoint fleet arrived as quickly as possible and saw Jingjiu sleeping soundly. There were ascendants in the Starpoint fleet, and more than one of them. Those regular officers and soldiers didn't know what was going on, but they did. A newcomer had come to their hometown. Jingjiu was brought into the battleship. After a preliminary check, he was frozen at a very low temperature and sent to General Li as quickly as possible. From the residual sword between his fingers, General Li could easily tell that he was a disciple of the Aoyama sect. In other words, he was his direct descendant. Just as he was about to treat Jingjiu's wounds and wake him up, the preliminary check report was sent to his desk. All the data in the report pointed to one fact, and that was that this unbelievably good-looking junior didn't seem to be an ordinary Taoist cultivator. Following that, the military laboratory conducted a series of more thorough checks on Jingjiu. General Li looked at the results and remained silent for a long time. Jingjiu's body was so strong that it was far stronger than the celestial bodies of ordinary ascendants. Even the mythical beasts and giants in the sea were not far from his level. Human civilization had already entered the interstellar era, but they couldn't find any way to break his skin. This news was sent to the ancestral star, to the small island in the Jade Sea, and was placed in front of the Patriarch of Aoyama. That night, the Patriarch drank 2 cups of wine, which was rare for him. He sighed and said, "It's finally here." What followed was still endless experiments. That perfect body was still perfect and unbreakable. When he was asleep, there was no way to enter his consciousness. Naturally, there was no way to control him. In the end, the military handed the perfect body to the Science Academy of the Federation. It was not because they expected the Science Academy to produce more results, but because the patriarch of Aoyama and generally had their own ideas. At a certain moment, Jingjiu opened his eyes and woke up. Hearing the discussion of the golden-haired scholar, he uttered for the first time in this world, and then he entered the known story. It was true. Everything had been arranged beforehand. Everything had been arranged from the moment he woke up in the laboratory in the Earth core to the moment she accepted his request. General Li was in control of the military, so how could he not know that he was an ascendant from Chaotian? The patriarch was still alive. How could he not recognize that Jingjiu was that sword? They were faced with a problem. If the humans wished to survive, they had to wipe out the sea of dark matter and ignite those permanent stars. Anyone who carried out the plan of igniting the stars with the all-in-one sword would die. That god couldn't escape from this fate. Would he be willing to make such a sacrifice, regardless of whether the all-in-one sword had developed a spiritual awareness or was occupied by a spiritual soul? We ask you to leave because we hope that you would realize the situation of the humans on your own and develop sympathy, or at least empathy. It would be better if you could develop a sense of responsibility. In fact, we have prepared a great deal of information for you, but you didn't need us. It took you only a short time to learn everything. Your learning speed is amazing. The patriarch thought that you wouldn't be willing to become someone else's sword, even if it was the sword of destiny for the humans. But I had a glimmer of hope until I read the book you wrote. We have learned who you are and roughly understood your thoughts. As such, we have set up a test to test you and let the praying hall get in touch with you, waiting for you to make the final choice. This was a very long investigation. This was a very big game, and it was also a multiple-choice question. If Jingjiu chose to become a member of the Butterfly Organization, he would be asked to let go of his spiritual world and leave his spiritual imprint to devote himself to the humans. If he chose to become a new god, he would be asked to connect with the whole starry sky, and then he would be attacked by the starry sky, like what he was doing now, and all of his independent awareness would be washed away. He didn't like this organization, the Butterfly Organization, because of the assassination tests. Jian Shilai's encounter and Chao Yuan's choice made him wary. It wasn't until Shun Yunmai suddenly disappeared and Jian Shilai suddenly appeared a few days ago that he decided to cooperate with the female priest. As such, he poured a cup of tea for Huaxi. It was a meaningless choice. He had lost the moment he made the choice, and the sword fell into the sheath. In other words, it was a choice made by the Great Grandmaster for him. To put more precisely, the Great Grandmaster had only provided two answers to this question. No matter which one Jingjiu chose, it would be the one the humans wanted. It could be understood that the Great Grandmaster had provided two paths for Jingjiu. No matter which path he chose, he would be where he was now. The path toward heaven, and each taking a different path. It was merely different paths leading to the same destination. When Jingjiu saw the large river and the young Taoist priest by the river in the spiritual world of Jian Shilai, he said everything was fake. It was true that everything was arranged by the Great Grandmaster of Aoyama. After the Great Grandmaster of Aoyama hid in the Sea of Stars, he pushed Jingjiu to the side of Huaxi and asked him to open up his spiritual world. The old man was intermittently visible among the stars in the sky, looking huge or great. Yet, he looked as ordinary as a retired old man who fished by the river every day. Looking at the starry sky, Jingjiu suddenly said, "I've seen the portrait of you." All the disciples of Aoyama had seen the portrait. The portrait was placed in the first place in the small building. It was the Great Grandmaster of Aoyama. Countless gazes fell on him, as they wanted to know what he wanted to say at the last moment before his life, or in other words, his independent awareness disappeared. I thought the painter was terrible, and that's why you looked so ugly in the portrait. Jingjiu went on. I didn't know until today that you were even uglier than in the portrait. Chapter 896. If sound could be transmitted in the universe, there would be an uproar at this moment. The Ascenders were shocked. The Aoyama Grandmaster was the first human to ascend, and he had an unimaginable position in history, but now he was being mocked by a direct descendant of the Aoyama sect. Then, They thought of Jing Jiu's true identity and somewhat understood. After all, he was not a member of the human race. The founding master of Aoyama slowly raised his head, revealing his hideous face under the conical hat. His expression was indifferent, and his emotions did not fluctuate at all because of these words. Deceiving one's master and destroying one's ancestors was not a part of the Aoyama sect's historical tradition, but Aoyama disciples did not have the habit of respecting their masters. At the very least, it had been so since the generation of Taiping Jinren and perfected Jingyang. Jing Jiu's impression of his master, Reverend Qin Zhou, was very vague. He had some feelings for his grandmaster, Reverend Dao Yuan. As for the sect's founder, who was regarded as a god by countless people, his impression of him had always been very poor. Back in Chaodian, he had told Zhao Liu and the others that the founding grandmasters regarded the all-in-one sword as a servant and tool, or even a slave, but he regarded the all-in-one sword as a friend and playmate. Therefore, they comprehended a completely different sword Dao through the same sword. This was the difference between Daos. There was nothing much to say, since people of different paths could not form an alliance. He just did not understand why that person would stand on the side of the founding master. His gaze pierced through the ice and landed on Hua Xi's still cute, but definitely not naive face. Previously, he told Hua Xi that they were the same kind of people, but Hua Xi said that he was not yet. This was not a sufficient reason. Hua Xi was very calm, without any fear. As soon as the 1,000-mile ice ceiling formation was dispersed, she would die instantly in this extremely cold and harsh space environment. However, as an observer, she could leave at the speed of light with just a thought. As for this body that was left behind, it was nothing more than a clone that she controlled with the chip at the back of her neck. She did not care at all. She said, "That day in the suite at Base 857, I asked you a few questions. If the issue of the sea of dark matter can't be resolved, will you try to leave?" "Of course." "One last question. If you were asked to sacrifice yourself in exchange for more people's lives, would you be willing?" "I'm not willing." "Why?" "As long as I live, humanity lives." Jing Jiu remembered those questions. At that time, he knew that they were part of the inspection. If the question was asked by General Li or the Grandmaster of Aoyama, he knew exactly how to answer in order to get high marks or even full marks. However, since she was the one asking the question, he wasn't sure what kind of answer she wanted to hear, so he directly said what he really thought. He felt that the entire human race didn't understand him, but she could. Hua Xi looked at him and said, "You say that you are alive means that humans are alive. The problem is that humans don't think so." Jing Jiu said calmly, "In a sense, I am a human." Of course, this sentence had a premise. It was a description of a specific situation at a specific time, but no matter what, it was extremely unimaginable for a person to actually say such a thing. This was already beyond the scope of self-confidence and narcissism, and could easily be seen as madness. Be it the intelligent life behind Hua, Xi, or the deceased god, none of them had ever been so self-assured. Everybody who heard this was stunned speechless. General Li raised his eyebrows, his red cloak fluttering without the aid of the wind. But the Grandmaster of Aoyama was as nonchalant as before. After a moment of silence, Hua Xi said, "Schiller wrote about an emperor in a history book. I'm not sure if that emperor is a real existence until now, but I remember something that the emperor said very clearly. He said, 'I am the state.' It looks like you're even more arrogant than he was." Jing Jiu said, "I don't know if that emperor died a violent death or was humiliated, but I believe that he must have thought so when he said it." Hua Xi said, "To prove this statement, you have to defeat the entire human civilization." "It's not necessary," said Jing Jiu. "Even so, you don't have the right to participate in this war. You are the weapon left by him. Destroying the sea of dark matter and finding the true hope for the humans is his last wish." Hua Xi continued, "His wish is above everything else, so I have to help him." The he in this sentence was naturally referring to that god. "The god is dead." Jing Jiu went on expressionlessly. "Your computer should have been turned off by him at the time. How could you know what he was thinking?" Huashi didn't expect him to predict the situation before the destruction of the distant ancient civilization. She was speechless. When I pick you up tens of thousands of years ago, I sense the will of God. The voice of the Grand Master of Aoyama echoed in the space. You are the hope he left for the human race. I've obtained this hope and become the first human to leave Chaotian. As such, I have a responsibility to keep this hope alive. This sentence sounded very touching and even a little romantic. In other words, the all-in-one sword had to be held in his hand forever. Jingjiu had no chance of escaping. As the conversation was going on, the information of the entire human civilization was still impacting Jingjiu's spiritual world. The program of the inherited heaven sword was on the verge of being written. Jingjiu's consciousness grew a bit muddled, and his mind grew dizzy. He vaguely thought of one thing. The severe injury of Shun Yunmai and the possible death of him were all decided by the Grand Master of Aoyama, whether it was for the sake of the probability collapse or to lure him into the sheath. As such, a certain question seemed to have been answered. The terrorist who called herself the Queen of the Dark Night was adopted by an old man at a young age, and the leader of that organization was an old man. You're the Qiming man, Jingjiu said to the Grand Master of Aoyama. That's right, the Grand Master of Aoyama replied. Jingjiu said, you're not only ugly, but you also don't know how to give names. Cocoon Breaker Butterfly, Qiming man, are you going to write a teenage mystery novel? The Grand Master of Aoyama didn't get angry, as he said, Chaotian is not a laboratory, and we're not the experimental subjects, but the chosen ones of God. We have the ability and the responsibility. The Qiming man, the founder of a new human civilization, was the self-recognition of the Grand Master of Aoyama, General Li, and the others. This kind of recognition was very responsible and honorable, and there was nothing wrong with it. The only problem was Jingjiu. Jingjiu wanted to represent the humans, but the humans didn't agree. He didn't agree with the humans' desire to represent Jingjiu either, and he didn't think the Grand Master's recognition was correct either. In his opinion, the one who could take the responsibility of starting a new civilization or who was qualified to be the Qiming man depended on one thing. It's easy to solve this problem, he said. The one who is alive is the one who is right. The Grand Master of Aoyama was truly powerful, especially his spiritual awareness, which could reach across the Milky Way and envelop the stars as if it were real. He was much more powerful than the Snow Girl in her heyday. However, he had ascended tens of thousands of years ago and left Chaotian. After a long period of time, he had become an old man, and his body had already withered. As long as he was found and his fairy body was destroyed, his spiritual awareness would be destroyed and the debate would be over. There were many stars in many galaxies. If those stars were extinguished, they would have to change their names. If the Grand Master died, how could they use the inherited heaven sword to control Jingjiu and start a new civilization? The struggle for the path toward heaven was as simple as this. If one looked at the end, the struggle had always been about the same thing. If it were any other time, the immortal Tan would be more excited when he set foot on the patch of the ocean, and he might even go against his usual habit and write a sad poem. This was the ancestral planet. This reason alone was enough to arouse everyone's interest in writing a poem. The everyone referred to those who had read the poem. The blue ocean was like this. It turned out that this was the meaning of cold or dark green. The blue sky was like this. It turned out that this was the meaning of blue and transparent. The mountains on the coastline were as green as ever, and the sandy beach on the island was as white as silver. Everything was so beautiful, perfectly fitting the distant, ancient memory of the collective unconscious of the humans. The small boat traveled forward while breaking through the waves. It didn't take long for it to arrive at the small island. The immortal Tan and the young man of the cyborg disembarked the boat and landed on the shore. There were countless peach trees on the island, the flowers blooming like fire, covering half of the volcano in the distance. After passing through the forest, the two of them arrived at the deep end of the small island, ignoring the snow-like flower petals falling on them. They passed through a passageway full of formations and laser weapons and arrived by the hot spring in the deepest part of the island. There was nobody by the hot spring, no wine cups, no chessboard, and no one was playing chess. Wow, what a surprise. The immortal Tan said this with a bitter expression while rubbing his oily forehead. The biochemical officer used a rays in his eyes to check the surroundings, saying, "There should be the so-called formation you people have mentioned." The immortal Tan remarked sentimentally, "Why are you still pretending at the moment? Do you think that we, who are from Chaotian, don't know how to act?" No sooner had he said this than countless bright light beams shot out from all directions and landed on him. Crack! The immortal Tan was broken into countless pieces along with a cracking sound. The eyes of the biochemical officer became exceedingly bright. It was not because he was excited, but because he was really scanning the surroundings. He didn't see any traces of immortal chi, nor did he see any traces of living beings. This meant that no real life had died here just now. All of a sudden, a tiny light speck started burning with a boom, instantly evaporating the hot spring in the pond and turning the salty water into white fog. In the fog, the face of the biochemical officer changed shape visibly, and then the skin peeled off, exposing the super alloy bones underneath. But the abnormality didn't end there. Countless fine cracks appeared on the surface of the alloy. The biochemical officer was shattered into countless tiny particles, and the whole manor cave was riddled with holes. A few lines of amulets flashed in the fog and then disappeared. There was another light smack. A pair of common elastic shoes landed on the dust like dust. The surface of the planet was full of craters and the radial traces left by the violent nuclear explosions. Standing by a broken flag, the immortal Tan looked at the blue planet in the night sky, his mind full of complicated emotions. Was that the hometown of the humans? Why did it feel so monotonous and lonely? There were many crustaceans in the blue, salty water and many mollusks in the green forest, but nothing else could be seen. It turned out that the other party had prepared for this. The immortal Jingyang would be in trouble then. Where should he hide? He suddenly sensed something and looked at the deep part of the universe. There was a sun there. A golden planet flew past the surface of the sun. It was extremely tiny, looking like a shooting spark. The immortal Tan looked in that direction silently, his broad forehead reflecting the sunlight, looking exceptionally bright. All of a sudden, he took out a Rubik's Cube from his sleeve and unraveled it as quickly as he could. He took out a small, toy-like bell and flicked it casually with his finger. The bell rang slowly. The light speck on the surface of the ancestral planet started to burn. In the meantime, a terrifying flame shot out from the permanent star, swallowing the golden planet instantly. Chapter 897. There was a battleship 7 million kilometers away from the Golden Planet. The shape of the battleship was different from that of most of the battleships in the Federation of the Milky Way. It was an irregularly round battleship, looking more like a fortress. It also looked like a small planet with a diameter of 100 kilometers. The bell rang loudly, coming from a distant place. In fact, the humans couldn't even hear it. Yet the sun heard it. It suddenly exploded and spat out a huge flame, swallowing the golden planet instantly. The battleship was also affected by the solar storm. The half-activated gravitational field caused a bright light to appear in the twisted space. The light passed through the windows and illuminated the world inside the battleship. The inside space of the battleship was extremely large, looking like a real planet. A simulated sun was rising in the east and setting in the west in the sky, illuminating the blue ocean, the prairie, and the humans living there. If Jing Jiao, Shun Yunmai, Jian Shilai, and the immortal Tan saw the sun, they would fall silent for a long time. Then, some of them remained silent, some of them cursed loudly, some of them sharpened their swords silently, and some of them turned around and left. The sun was actually a superparticle-driven furnace, but it didn't have a shell, and it was extremely large. One could easily imagine how powerful it was. It turned out that the human civilization had advanced much further than they had imagined. There was a small island in the middle of the blue ocean with a volcano in the middle of the island and a hot spring in the volcano. The Grand Master of Aoyama and the woman in the bathrobe, who called herself Faye, were drinking wine and playing chess by the hot spring, deciding the future of the human civilization. They were still playing the same game of 5 in a row. The 4 black go pieces had formed a line. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't change the outcome of the game. According to the rules of 5 in a row, many fixed patterns were not allowed, but the situation on the chessboard was obviously not one of them. The woman in the bathrobe pouted her lips and blew the black hair on her forehead like the skin of a watermelon, saying, "Shinaoyama, you're cheating again." Nobody, be it the people of the Federation of the Milky Way or the ascendants of Chaotian, would call the Grand Master of Aoyama by his name, but she was the special one. She reached out her hand and pulled the chess pieces on the chessboard into a mess. As a result, there was no winner in this game of 5 in a row. Yet, some things had to have a winner, like the battle between them and Jingjio. The girl suddenly said, "The immortal Tan and Jian Shilai can live." The ancestral master of Aoyama said, "Yes." The girl said, "If Jingyang surrenders, that's fine too." The Grand Master of Aoyama was silent for a while, then said, "Of course." As his voice fell, a second bell rang from the depths of the distant universe. It went against the solar wind and landed on the surface of the burning fireball before being knocked back. The sound of the bell drove the flames of the sun, engulfing the golden planet once again. It became even more violent, engulfing the huge battleship in a tongue of fire. The blue lake rippled and then boiled, producing countless bubbles. Mist instantly pervaded the huge body of the ship, filling every corner. The Grand Master of Aoyama commented, "It looks like the story is not entirely true. The immortal Tan's cultivation state is evidently higher than that of the Bai family. If the immortal Tan were as cowardly as a mouse, why would he join hands with him to destroy the foundation of the Bai family?" The girl got up and looked at the blue planet in the distance outside the window. She said softly, "This person must be ruthless enough. Even so, he's no match for us. Why would he dare to ring the Sina Cloud Bell? According to the story, he should continue to hide." The Grand Master of Aoyama put away the 4 black chess pieces, stood up, and walked to the girl's side. "That's why I didn't expect him to suddenly appear and affect this story." The girl said calmly, "They're from the same hometown, the same age, the same comrade in arms, just like us." The Grand Master of Aoyama was silent for a while, then said, "That makes sense." On the surface, it looked calm and quiet, but in reality, there were countless dangers hidden. The wind was rising and the clouds were scudding, and the dark sea was rippling. The bell rang for the 3rd time and landed on the sun, stirring up even more light plasma. Borrowing the gravity of the golden planet, it turned into a light arrow and attacked the battleship. The warship's gravitational field equipment was still not fully activated because it needed to ensure that the divine sense could reach the other side of the universe and monitor the situation on the battlefield. The Grand Master of Aoyama flicked his fingers, and countless sword lights left his body and cut the high-temperature and scorching light plasma into countless pieces, scattering like fireflies. He is the all-in-one sword and the weapon left by the gods. But no matter what kind of existence he is still dead. He is used to calculating things, but he doesn't understand the principle that the power of calculation is limited and the world is infinite. He withdrew his gaze and looked at the messy chess pieces on the chessboard, saying, even if he had calculated everything, he would still lose in the end. The girl said, "I don't like to hear that, but it is the truth." The bell rang again, and the sun became more and more violent. The light plasma was like a waterfall, but it couldn't hurt the battleship at all. It gradually faded away, like the echo of a funeral. More than 10,000 battleships flew toward the galaxy outside the mist, spurting out beautiful flames. They looked like a torrent made of burning, flying swords. Those ascenders ignored the extremely cold universe and left their battleships, flying toward the asteroid belt at a high speed. They looked like dozens of bright stars. The civilization of mankind had developed to this day, and it was truly great. The scene at the moment could be called a cluster of shining stars. The only thing that was a bit boring was that the enemy of mankind today was Jingjio. After a slight click, an unimaginably huge wave was raised in his ocean of consciousness. The program talisman emitted a clear glow, as if it had condensed into a real halo, covering his wrists, ankles, and neck. These halos were the new Inherited Heaven Sword. The Inherited Heaven Sword was specially designed to restrain the all in one sword. A strange energy wave arose in the depths of the universe, attacking Jingjio's Dao heart from the outside to the inside. It started to resonate with the tiniest part of his body, forming an extremely firm and locked-in connection. The energy wave and the resonance formed an unimaginably magnificent force that controlled his body, making it impossible for him to even lift his middle finger. "I will try my best to preserve your self-awareness," Huashi said to him. When she said this, there was no emotional change on the girl's face, but her eyes were a bit brighter, seeming to be somewhat credible. Jingjio didn't notice it, because he was pondering something important with his head lowered. The scheme set up by the Grandmaster of Aoyama and the strike by Huashi were unexpected to him. But the unexpected didn't mean that he didn't anticipate it at all. He had calculated the hundreds of millions of chess pieces on the Scorching Sun battleship for so many days. How could he have missed this? All these possibilities were in the mathematical model, and he had made the corresponding plans. But the probability was too low, so he didn't think too much about it. The main problem was that he was too confident. The ring was the product of the civilization of Chaotian and the Federation of the Milky Way, a divine weapon of the highest state, like Shen Yunmai. But it was not the new Inherited Heaven Sword that he was most wary of. The new Inherited Heaven Sword was not a ring, a handcuff, a bracelet, or even a material object. It was a program. The Grandmaster of Aoyama had become a programmer. Who could have expected this? Of course, he wouldn't admit defeat. According to the mathematical model he had built beforehand, he had a 7% chance of winning the battle. If Jian Shilai woke up, the chance would be 17%. If Chao Yuan woke up all of a sudden, the chance would be increased by 3%. If he followed his original plan and found the Snow Girl through what had happened that day, the chance of winning would be more than 40%. Of course, if the Immortal Tan could kill the Grandmaster on the Ancestral Planet, the chance of winning would be 100%. Unfortunately, it seemed that Lao Tan didn't succeed. Fortunately, he must have many ways to protect himself, so there was no need to worry about his life. All he needed to worry about was his own life. It was not the life and death of the chess game, but the real life and death. Countless tiny golden glows like spores came out from Jingjio's body, which were the most minute components of the fairy energy. It meant that his Dao heart had already been weakened, and he couldn't control his body or the fairy energy in his body. However, he couldn't leave or even move under the restraint of the Inherited Heaven Sword. He looked like those fairy masters who were bound to the fairy execution platform by the heavenly court in the distant ancient myths and legends, waiting to be hacked into pieces. The stars in the sky were gathering at a high speed, resembling the scene of the Big Bang. Those stars were the battleships, as well as the powerful ascendants. They were the grandmasters of the Zen sects, the stone men of Chunwu Mountain, and many other famous figures in the history of the cultivation circle in Chaotian. Yes, at this stage of the story, even these great characters can only collectively appear in front of us in the form of the four words Ascenders. Jingjio, covered in the fairy fog, appeared more and more clearly in their sight. The emotions in their sight grew more and more complicated. The most powerful ascendant in Chaotian lowered his head, as if he had fallen asleep. He was losing the last bit of his self-awareness and became the new immortal Jingyang, the new weapon of the permanent star state, or a dead man. It was then that the voice of Jian Shilai broke out. "Immortal, do you think I can live forever?" His voice was not as sincere, cheerful, and sunny as before, devoid of any emotion, but rather nonchalant. There was no smile on his face, It was expressionless, as if he had turned back into the statue he had been before. This question was rather baffling, especially at the moment, but he asked it earnestly. It was like a youth with excellent behavior and studies asked his mother if he could read the physics books for the next 3 years the next day. Jingzhou answered the question earnestly as well, even though his consciousness was a bit confused and he would die soon. Yes. Though he was being serious, he didn't think too long about it. In fact, he gave the answer in a split second without any hesitation. Jian Shilai looked at him expressionlessly and said, "Immortal, you still like to deceive people." One of them asked the question inexplicably and earnestly, and the other answered the question inexplicably and earnestly. Huashi looked at Jian Shilai, feeling a bit surprised. General Li looked at Jian Shilai coldly. The Grandmaster of Aoyama in the starry sky also looked at Jian Shilai appreciatively. Jingzhou said while staring at Jian Shilai's eyes, "No." Chapter 898. The expression in General Li's eyes grew a bit dull and then cold. It was because he had discovered the change in Jian Shilai. The enthusiasm and yearning in Jian Shilai's eyes were gone. Soon, he understood what had happened. Huashi accepted Jingzhou's request and put the ring on his finger. The information of the entire human civilization flooded into his awareness. Jingzhou had left a spiritual awareness in Jian Shilai's spiritual world, which was the means of General Li and the reason why he couldn't stay away from it. The torrential flow of information entered his awareness and arrived in Jian Shilai's mind along the spiritual awareness, destroying the large river instantly. The riverbank collapsed, and the river flowing toward the sea turned into a torrential flood without any direction. The sword of the 12-story building left Jingzhou's body and surrounded the young Taoist priest. Countless sword marks appeared on his red Taoist robe. They were the will of water and also the sword awareness of Jian Shilai. This was the spiritual world of Jian Shilai. When he was awake, he was the sole master here, the true God. The young Taoist priest was slashed into nothingness in an instant. The river flowing toward the sea was gone as well. The flowers grew in the wilderness. Jian Shilai woke up. Don't. Jingzhou didn't like to talk, but he had said this many times. It was because he didn't like to talk and was unwilling to agree to someone's request that he said this many times. Back when he was still the immortal Jingyang, Lu Xi and Yuan Qijing invited him to eat hot pot and play mahjong, and he often heard this reply. The all-in-one had heard of it, and so had Lu Shui. Later, he went to Zhaoga City and met Jing Li at the Jing house. Jing Li asked him to hug him, but he didn't want it. Zhao Lei wanted to do something to him after she learned his identity, but he didn't want it. Huashi wanted to sit on the chair, but he didn't want it. There were many people who had heard of this word before. After Jian Shilai woke up that day, he said it as quickly as he could, but he didn't forget to add, "I have a way." Jian Shilai didn't heed him. Looking at his reaction, Jingzhou was a little displeased or even angry. He was even angrier than when he found out that he had fallen into the trap set up by the Grandmaster of Aoyama and that person. When he saw the heavenly tribulation at the West Sea, he was very angry. When he saw the spring rain, he was very angry. When he saw the myriad rays of dawn, he became even angrier. At this time, he was also very angry. Jian Shilai sensed the change in Jingzhou's mood, but he didn't pay any attention to him. He turned to General Li and said, "It's really strange. I've remembered those things all the time, but why do I feel different now?" After being captured on that mineral star, he had been subjected to countless experiments and mental torture. He still remembered those scenes. There was indeed some humiliation and a lot of pain, but at this moment, he felt that it was necessary, and understandable. From the moment he woke up, all the feelings were the same, but the meaning was completely different. It might be necessary, or understandable, but it was not something he could accept. What was deep sleep and what was awake? This was an interesting question. I've figured out. The dead don't care about what has happened to them. It's like I've come back to life. Jian Shilai continued with a faint smile. In that case, I've lived one more moment. Why can't I accept it? His expression was solemn, like that of a statue. His smile looked like a flower blossoming on a rock, which was not very good looking. Generally understood what he meant and his decision. He didn't try to persuade Jian Shilai, but flew toward the deep part of the universe behind him. The red cloak brought out a straight red line, as if it would penetrate the universe. In the next moment, a sword light illuminated the universe. The sword light and the red line passed through the asteroid belt full of meteorites and rocks soundlessly, stirring up a great deal of dust. Jian Shilai and General Li looked at each other in silence on the other side of the asteroid belt thousands of kilometers wide. Seeing this, those ascendants and the officers and soldiers on the battleships who were on their way here fell silent, but they were not worried. Jian Shilai had suddenly woken up and struck out violently, but he couldn't change the current situation. He was the successor of the Foggy Island in the South Ocean, and he had comprehended the highest state of the sword work of Aoyama, the all-in-one. He was indeed a rare genius in the sword work. Yet, his opponent was General Li. If the generation of Jingjiu, Jian Shilai, and Bai Run were not counted, the immortal Chunyang was the last ascendant in Chaotian. Yet, he had subdued so many ascendants of the previous generations and became the revered General Li. In addition to his status as the sect master of Aoyama, his cultivation state was unimaginably high, and his methods were formidable and formidable. Back when he was in Chaotian, he had joined hands with the emperor of that generation and repelled the invasion of the underworld army in Ozawa, laying the foundation for more than 1,000 years of peace in Chaotian. He was the second person after the founding grandmasters of Aoyama to comprehend the all-in-one. The rest of the ascendants of the Aoyama sect were all in the hidden heaven state. It was impossible to defeat such a person, and he had already defeated Jian Shilai once. That time doesn't count, Jian Shilai said expressionlessly. His voice traveled through the airless space, causing thousands of meteorites to vibrate and generate more dust. Those meteorites turned slowly along with his right hand, pointing their sharp sides at General Li, who was thousands of kilometers away. Sensing the fairy energy coming out from Jian Shilai's body, General Li said nonchalantly, "Even though I've installed a nuclear power furnace on you, it doesn't mean you can resist me." No sooner had he said this than more meteorites in the asteroid belt turned along with his hand, aiming at Jian Shilai in the distance like swords. Without any sign, countless meteorites left their original positions, which hadn't changed for hundreds of millions of years. They turned into thousands of flying swords, heading toward the opposite side at an unimaginable speed. Thousands of sword lights illuminated the asteroid belt, but they emitted a brighter glow after being refracted by the dust. In the next moment, the sword lights transformed from the meteorites had finally met in the space, producing more dazzling sparks, like a soundless and grand firework. The ascendants were greatly astonished. This was the first time they had witnessed such a scene, though it was the highest state of the sword work in Chaotian. Everything could be used as a sword. Though the space seemed empty, there were always some dust and meteorites. It was for this reason that General Li chose the asteroid belt in the galaxy outside the Foggy Galaxy to hold the meeting. Yet, he didn't expect Jingjiu to be able to wake Jian Shilai up. For Jian Shilai, who had also mastered the all-in-one, this asteroid belt was also an inexhaustible sword pool. A great number of meteorites left the asteroid belt and turned into stone, swords heading toward the opposite side. They met in the empty and dark space, turning into fireworks and then into dust. Even though there were many small celestial bodies in the asteroid belt, it was not really an inexhaustible sword pool. In a short time, those harder, smaller, and more destructive meteorites had been used up by General Li and Jian Shilai, turning into green smoke in the space. In the next moment, they had no choice but to choose the lighter and weaker celestial bodies. Summoned by the sword wills, those celestial bodies started to accelerate, and their cores started to evaporate, leaving trails behind as they turned into comets. Thousands of comets appeared in a place far away from the permanent star, leaving trails of various colors and shapes. It was truly a beautiful scene. No matter how beautiful the scene was, it would vanish in the end, as was the intention of the comets. The moment the comets in the sky vanished, the sword fight had finally come to an end. The asteroid belt was empty, and there was no longer any substantial existence to be found. It was like the chess game in which all the materials had been used up. Both of them were the peak state of the sword work and the highest state of the path. It was hard to distinguish between the infinite, and the chess game could be a draw. However, this was a war. General Lee was not as simple as a cultivation practitioner. He was a leader. He was also a military strategist. While he and Jian Shilai fought with the meteorites as swords, many battleships were ready for the battle. The moment the sword fight came to an end, hundreds of laser beams broke through the dark space, illuminating the few remaining meteorites in the asteroid belt and the interstellar dust. An ear-piercing, tearing sound broke out in the soundless space. The cold space seemed to give off a burning smell. The few remaining meteorites had suddenly moved. If the space was the ocean, those meteorites were like the reefs. The ocean waves couldn't move the reefs, but the reefs seemed to change their positions when the ocean water rose up. The area where the asteroid belt was seemed to have disappeared. The distance between Jian Shilai and General Lee was shrinking rapidly. Many holes had appeared on General Lee's red overcoat, looking like a war flag that had been shot through by a group of arrows. Jian Shilai looked even worse. The surface of his body was full of wounds, flowing with a sticky substance resembling motor oil. Like I said, the last time doesn't count. He said this while staring into General Lee's eyes. The two of them had a similar swordwork state. The reason he was defeated last time was because General Lee had a superparticle nuclear power furnace with him, which had an almost endless source of fairy energy. Today, he had one in his body as well. As soon as he said this, the nuclear power furnace exploded. The bright light spread in all directions, devouring everything. The laser beams coming from the deep part of the universe, and the two strongest swordsmen in the sword work from Chaotia. Chapter 899. There were 4 asteroid belts in the galaxy beyond the fog. The meeting place was the outermost one. This place was very far from the permanent star, and the light was dim. All of a sudden, a new sun rose up. The bright light illuminated the remaining broken pieces of the meteorites and the dust, as well as General Lee's face. His face showed a baffled expression. Jian Shilai's face was illuminated as well, but he still looked nonchalant. However, his face looked like a stone statue, clean and transparent. Along with the bright light, an unimaginable heat erupted. The broken pieces of the meteorites nearby were vaporized instantly, and the dust turned into green smoke, leaving nothing behind. The fireball was expanding at an unimaginable speed. The light was like a thin sword of the Taoist sword, piercing toward all directions in the universe. The battleships flying over at a high speed pushed back urgently and entered the half-activated state of the gravitational field as quickly as they could. The high-strength composite material plates dropped down as if they were entering a warped hole. The few battleships in the front were affected by the explosion of the nuclear power furnaces. Instead of bobbing up and down like the wrecked ships in the ocean, they were stimulated and emitted bright light. It was unclear how many people had died on the battleships. The bodies of the gray battleships were made of a highly heat-resistant material made of cluster fibers, but they still couldn't withstand the heat of the sun. The nuclear power furnaces, as the most advanced technology in the Federation of the Milky Way, were many times more formidable than the regular nuclear bombs. It was strange that the hexagonal ice block in the asteroid belt didn't melt, and there wasn't even a crack on its seemingly thin surface. It was probably because Jing Jiao had lost control of his body and couldn't leave. He employed the magic method to protect himself and the ice block at the same time. Huashi hovered in the ice block while holding the doll in her arms. She looked at the back of Jing Jiao in the sun with her hands on the thin ice block. It was unclear what she was thinking. The air exhaled from her pink lips turned into white mist because of the low temperature of the environment. The mist turned into solid frost when it landed on the ice, gradually blocking the scene outside. Jingjiu was also looking at the sun. The ascendants were also looking at the sun. General Li had been pushed to a distant place by the explosion, drifting toward a battleship. There was only one figure in the sun. No, it was half a figure. The figure was emitting a bright glow, looking exceedingly eye-catching. There was an archipelago in the South Ocean of Chaotian, shrouded in a thick fog all the way to the archipelago, so it was hard to see the sun, let alone the dazzling sun. At least it had been like this since the day Shilai was born on the island. One day, he was chosen as the personal disciple of the old man in the black coffin and came into contact with the supreme sword Tao that mortals couldn't come into contact with. At that moment, he thought he saw the sun. One day later, he left the foggy island on a small boat and arrived in Chaotian. He chose to stay in the West Ocean to continue cultivating, not only because of the fallen immortal island and the sword Tao inheritance of his sect, but also because of the high winds and high waves here. High winds and high waves were generally used to describe a dangerous environment. However, because of the strong winds, there were few clouds, and one could often see the scorching sun here. After that, he did not do anything else. After establishing the Western Sea Sword School, he had been cultivating in silence, accepting disciples, and preaching. When his junior brother Shuang's son came, he handed over all the affairs to him and spent all his time and energy on the sword work. In the stories of the cultivation circle in Chaotian, Jian Shilai's image was always vague or monotonous, no different from those villains in the stories. In comparison to Lin Sanyue, Chao Yuan, and the others, his personality was not distinctive, and his actions were rather boring, similar to that of the immortal Jingyang. It was because he was as simple as Jingyang. The goal of the cultivation practitioners was to live a long life and to reach the end of time. He wanted to go to the end of the sword work to have a look. Such a simple cultivation life had resulted in an outstanding sword work state. It was similar to Peng Lang of the No Mercy sect, whom he and Jing Jiu both admired. His cultivation state had improved at an unimaginable speed, and he had defeated the sect master of the No Mercy sect, Pei Baifa, and the highly achieved swordsmen of various sects with ease. Soon, he had reached the highest state of the sword work, second only to the immortal Jingyang. He had helped the Western Sea Sword School develop under the influence of the Aoyama sect all by himself, and he was honored as the godly swordsman of West Ocean, as famous as the broadsword king Chao Yuan. When the immortal Jingyang ascended, he left the West Ocean and hid in the clouds to observe the situation. He intended to take a look at the end of the sword work, but he was discovered and forced to retreat by Lu Si. Later, he continued his cultivation and took on disciples, but he was betrayed by his disciples, and then his dying master, Nanchu, arrived. In fact, he was already tired of it at the time, but he understood his master's persistence. As such, he fought against the Aoyama sect again, but he was defeated by Taiping Jinren and Jing Jiu, the two brothers. He was severely wounded and had to flee in defeat. He went to the distant alien land and became the Silent Sword King for several decades. He paid no attention to the church and the disputes, and he didn't even think of taking revenge. He didn't really care about those things. How could he go to the highest state of the sword work if he couldn't figure out? In the end, Taiping Jinren intended to destroy the world. He knew that the immortal Jingyang would ascend if he won the battle. As such, he came back by treading on the ocean waves, intending to prove his Tao with the sword. He comprehended the essence of the all-in-one. He was defeated by Jing Jiu again, but he didn't die. He encountered General Li after his ascension, another swordsman who had mastered the all-in-one. He was defeated by General Li, but he didn't die. He had finally won the battle today, but he was going to die. Countless stars lit up in the fleet. It was a sign that the long-range weapons had been activated. Thousands of laser beams and many unknown long-range weapons of particle flow were heading toward Jian Shilai after traveling a long distance. Nobody could resist the attack of a fleet, Neither he nor Jingjiao. The broken pieces of the meteorites in the sky were pulled and pushed by the tide-like sword wheels and formed 12 stone pillars, forming an ancient and powerful formation that blocked the laser beams for the time being. The surface of the stone pillars grew brighter and brighter, and it seemed that they would break apart in the next moment. A black battleship accelerated and arrived at the asteroid belt at the risk of being affected by the nuclear explosion, in an attempt to take the severely wounded General Li away. His red overcoat was torn, and his body was even more damaged. The golden and jade fairy energy kept flowing into the space, turning into small burning beads. He was indeed one of the strongest swordsmen in the history of the cultivation world in Chaotian. He survived the explosion of the nuclear power furnace at such a close distance. Jian Shilai's condition was even worse. His body below his chest had been vaporized, with only the upper half of his body remaining. His condition was better than Shun Yunmai's, as both of his arms were still intact. His line of sight fell on General Li after traveling a distance of several thousand kilometers. The expression in his eyes was cold and nonchalant, devoid of any regret. It was because it was not over yet. He raised his broken and burning arms from a long distance away and then dropped them slowly. He was like a bird that had flown for a lifetime and decided to close its wings and sleep forever after feeling tired. An unimaginably deathly and gloomy energy appeared in the space. It was so cold in the space, but why did such a distinct energy appear except on the side, directly illuminated by the fixed stars? It was because the remains of the explosion of the nuclear power furnace hadn't dissipated yet, and the whole space was filled with light and heat. One could sense the cold only when it was hot. One could see the darkness only when it was bright. One could sense death only when he was alive. General Li sensed a gloomy and yet somewhat familiar energy approaching from all directions. It was the stone beam between Shuriwe Peak and Shilai Peak, on which he had recited the scripts. There was frost on the stone beam, and bamboo leaves on the frost. He had taught that evil creature a lesson. Crack! That formless, deathly, still aura landed on his body like a folded wing. The body of the battleship was opened, and the stone man of Chun Wushan flew out. He sensed that something was amiss. His body grew abruptly against the light of the distant fixed star, blocking most of the attack for General Li. Though he had the strongest defense in the history of Chaotian, a deep cut appeared on his back. What was that deathly and gloomy energy? Jian Shilai's arms fell down slowly. His arms were long, suitable for wielding a sword. Together with the remaining half of its body, it really did look like a bird. Together with the tattered military uniform, he looked like a dying bird with festering feathers. This is the shadow of death, the last sword I've comprehended. How is it compared to yours? He turned to Jingjiao and asked. Almost the same, said Jingjiao, but the name is a bit more ordinary. The light and heat from the explosion of the nuclear power furnace had finally passed through the formation of sealing ice of 1,000 miles and landed on the ice cubes. The frost formed by the breath melted again. Huashi felt warm, but her face was pale and her eyes looked a bit bewildered. It was unclear if she was disturbed by the radiation. The ring was a bit deformed, and the information passage was not as stable and unbreakable as before. Jingjiao didn't pay any attention to it. Why? He asked Jian Shilai. Why did the spring rain exist? Why did the morning sunlight exist? Though it was difficult to achieve eternity, it should be pursued with great effort. I found that bird on the ocean and came ashore with its corpse in my arms. I sat by the lake of the 3,000 nunnery for a long time and comprehended something. Jian Shilai continued, What I comprehended is not what you want. My attitude toward death is different from yours. I've given up in the end, said Jingjiao. I've read many books about this place when I was on the Mineral Star. I've read a saying that the greatest possibility lies in the self-abandonment. Jian Shilai added in the end, and since you said you're a human, you're me. It doesn't matter if I die, but it's enough for you to live on. A philosopher had said that suicide was the only serious philosophical issue, because death was the basis of existence. As for Jian Shilai's choice, it would be clearer. Since he couldn't live forever, it didn't matter when he left. You're me. It doesn't matter who lives on. Jingjiu said, the human philosophers are not experienced enough when it comes to thinking about problems. He had intended to say that these two statements were confusing and inexplicable, but it was because he had thought of many similar things before his friend's grave when he was young, and it was a special moment, so his tone was rather mild, devoid of his usual nonchalance. Yes, said Jian Shilai. Maybe I'm just a bit tired. It was hard for him to leave the foggy island, to look at the sun, to manage the Western Sea Sword School, to think and deal with some matters, and to keep advancing in the sword work. This was the last statement he made in this world. After saying this, his arms slowly fell down, like a bird falling into a deep sleep. The statement about the greatest possibility should have been said by Heidegger. The statement about suicide being the only serious one should have been said by Camus. Of course, I'm just using it casually. End of this chapter. Chapter 900. The collision of the all-in-one sword, the explosion of the nuclear furnace, and the shapeless sword named the Shadow of Death had caused a violent turbulence in the space of the universe. The battleship slowed down, and the laser beams became thinner. Even the shadows of the Grand Masters of Aoyama among the stars were gradually dispersing. As far as the Ascendants were concerned, what Jian Shilai said before his death had shocked them even more. The cultivation practitioners who could ascend from Chaotian were all the true immortals, possessing wisdom beyond the imagination of mortals, regardless of what kind of wisdom they had. Looking at the half of the corpse in the distance that looked like a sleeping bird, the people fell silent, each of them having different thoughts. The Grandmaster of Zen thought of his guide, the sage Tsung, who was pondering the chess game under the ground of Planet 857 and had no idea what had happened in the outside world. He decided to change his name and then go to kill the sage. The stone man of Chun Wu Mountain flew toward the battleship while holding the severely wounded General Li in his hand, while enduring the excruciating pain in his back. He decided to go to the number 2 forward base to find that young man who used the broadsword and fight with him. The thin ice melted gradually, and the formation of sealing ice of 1,000 miles was in the final stage before its collapse. The bewilderment and indifference in Hua Shi's eyes grew more intense, showing a painful expression. In the suite of the 857 base, Jingjiu told her that he was a human being as long as he was alive, and he had told her that he was a human being. She told him that the humans didn't think so. Jian Shilai was a member of the human race and a member of the upper class. He cast his vote and stood on the side of Jingjiu. This was the first vote obtained by Jingjiu. His mood hadn't changed much because of Jian Shilai's death, at least on the surface. The explosion of a nuclear furnace provided endless light and heat, which made him feel a bit warm. It also interrupted the torrent of information from the human civilization entering his mind for a moment, making him more clear-headed. As a result, he had the last few words with Jian Shilai. Normally, he should have tried to escape or counterattack in such a rare moment of clear-headedness, but he used it to talk to Jian Shilai without using his spiritual awareness. The conversation had to be heard by the universe, and he and Jian Shilai were both people of few words, so it wouldn't take long. The embers of the nuclear explosion began to recede, and the 10,000 warships once again prepared to attack. The engines and weapon platforms once again lit up the sky with stars. The starlight was a little dazzling. Jingjiu closed his eyes and pursed his lips, as if he was secretly exerting strength. Countless strands of awe-inspiring sword intent emanated from his body. Some of them circled around the ring that was already slightly deformed, but they were unable to break through the gravitational field and come into contact with the ring. Teeth were the hardest part of a human being, and he was the hardest human being. One could imagine how much power he had when he clenched his teeth. In literary works, gnashing one's teeth was often used to describe determination and hatred after a great emotional upheaval, but he was not like that. A crisp sound rang in Huaxi's ears. In the entire universe, she was the only one who heard this sound. Jing Jiu chewed on something. A few wisps of blue mist leaked out from the corners of his lips and nose, and were instantly sucked back into his body. The thing he chewed on was a small vial made of super alloy, which contained the same magic drug Shen Yunmai had used on Holiday Planet. Shen Yunmai's head was the only thing left after the explosion of the nuclear power furnace that day, and Jing Jiu brought him back to the suite on the top floor of the hotel. There was still half a box of magic drugs left in the suite, which Jing Jiu put away. As for where he put it away, after he left Chaotian, he had no place to hide the hidden world. He recalled a method he had employed a few days ago, which was to swallow the things he wanted to hide into his stomach. The magic drug was used to treat peripheral neuropathy in the beginning. Later, it was found that it could adjust the discharge of the cranial nerves, but the side effect was so severe that it could be regarded as the most powerful poison. A single drop of the magic drug could kill many people. The amount of magic drug in the small vial made of super alloy he chewed on could kill hundreds of thousands of people if it was distributed evenly. Jing Jiu's face grew paler, his eyelashes quivering slightly. The powerful poison became even more dreadful under the influence of the sword's source. It entered the structure of his brain at a high speed and blocked the discharge of electricity in some areas. As a result, he was able to stop the influx of information from the human civilization for the time being, making him more clear-headed. From this point of view, he should really thank Shen Yunmai. Then, he opened his eyes and saw another person he should thank. It was interesting that the two people he should thank had only a small part of their bodies left. The only difference was that Jian Shalai was already dead, and Shen Yunmai was still waiting for his death in the boundless underworld. It was probably because Jian Shalai's corpse didn't turn into the fairy energy in the cold and boundless universe, and it didn't generate any response from heaven and earth. Jing Jiu pulled back his gaze and looked at the distant battleship, his eyes calm. He could only see the sword light and the faint insanity in the deepest part of his eyes. The remnants of the nuclear explosion began to fade away. 10,000 battleships were ready to attack again. The engines and weapon platforms lit up the sky like stars again. The stone man of Chun Wu Mountain grabbed General Li and was on the verge of returning to the battleship. General Li was also looking at Jing Jiu in the distance, his eyes showing a hint of tiredness and bewilderment. Jing Jiu's awareness was on the verge of being destroyed. More importantly, the program of the Grandmaster of Aoyama had already entered his body. The sword was already sheathed. What else could he do when he was still the immortal Jingyang? He had seldom left the manor cave of Aoyama. He traveled with Lien Sanuel once in a while, and his cultivation state was quite high, so he had never been wounded. The only time he was truly in danger was during the civil strife in Aoyama. No, it was twice. After he failed in his ascension, he was reborn as a sword and started his cultivation again. It was even harder for him to be wounded, except for the time when he was at the West Ocean. Oh, he thought of the dead man in front of him again. The other times he was in danger were when he fought against the power of heaven and earth in the huge whirlpool. He hadn't been wounded since his cultivation state reached a high level, not to mention the desperate situation he was in now. The wound was not on his body, but on his Tao heart and spiritual soul. The program was like a chain in his spiritual world, which then turned into a green rope of light and tied to his wrist. As a result, he felt his body was exceedingly heavy and couldn't move at all. When he had the last conversation with Jian Shalai, he had already made hundreds of simulations in his Tao heart and ascertained that he couldn't employ the underworld fairy sword to travel 10,000 miles to kill someone, nor could he employ any magic method. The thin green rope of light was very formidable. In fact, it was the new inherited heaven sword. His current situation was that the sword was in the sheath and couldn't leave it. What should he do then? He decided to use a completely new way of fighting. He didn't like this way of fighting because it was often seen in the movies and TV works. It was also because he didn't have to use it before. But the current situation was special, so he had to try everything. A nuclear power furnace, appeared in the debris of the asteroid belt, dozens of kilometers away from the melting thousand-mile frozen formation. In the vast universe, this distance was no different from being within reach. The nuclear power furnace was given to him by Shun Yun Mai, and it had been kept in the black backpack. Huashi took it out at the beginning of the battle and tied it to his body. It was unclear when it had drifted to that place. A small sun appeared in the dark universe by the edge of the galaxy outside the fog without any sign. The terrifying light and heat spread out in all directions, affecting all the observation devices and making the locking systems of the weapons on those battleships lose their effectiveness temporarily. The explosion of the nuclear power furnace was many times more powerful than the explosion of the multi-phase nuclear bombs. Even though it was dozens of kilometers away, the temperature around the thousand-mile frozen formation had reached 40,000 degrees Celsius. Jing Zhou's calculation was very accurate. This was exactly the upper limit of the temperature he could withstand. The thousand-mile frozen formation melted in an instant, and Huashi's face turned pale under the light. The remaining air couldn't escape at a high speed, and she would die in the next moment. Jing Zhou didn't care about her life or death. He pointed his finger at the battleship in the distance. Countless active high-energy particles entered his body like an inexhaustible supply of immortal qi. A bright sword light illuminated his eyes, and then the entire universe. In an instant, only in an instant, his arm became thinner, and so did his wrist. The cyan rope of light tightened. The real change was in his fingers, where an incomparably bright and sharp sword appeared. The sword extended into the depths of the universe, getting thinner and thinner. It became a bright drill. It became a rope. It became a thread. In the end, it became a thin thread invisible to the naked eye. It came to the bottom of the battleship and pierced through General Li's chest. It only took a simple calculation to know how thin the thread would be when it was thousands of kilometers away. It was already less than the length of a superparticle and had entered the atomic level. Without a doubt, this was the thinnest sword in the history of human civilization. Logically, such a thin thread couldn't exist, even if there was no wind in the universe. It could only mean that the tiny structure that made up this thread contained an unimaginably strong force. Being thin meant being sharp, but it didn't mean being lethal. Otherwise, the cosmic rays would be the rulers of this world. Naturally, Jing Zhou wouldn't make this kind of mistake. With a single thought, the countless high-speed particles in his body traveled thousands of kilometers away through this thread, bombarding every single part of General Li's body. In essence, this finger of his was a heavy ion cannon that could travel thousands of kilometers. Heavy ions were atomic nuclei with a mass of more than 4. Under the precise control of human beings, they had a wide range of uses, especially in the medical field. Before the advent of genetic modification therapy, they were the safest and most effective treatment for solid cancer. But like a scalpel, they could be used to cut tumors or diseased tissues, and they could also be used to slit throats to kill people. The heavy ions could bombard the cancer cells accurately, and they could also bombard the healthy cells, causing them to die quickly. Of course, General Li had cultivated for thousands of years and been tempered by the fairy energy many times. As a result, there were no regular cells in his body. What he had were tiny structures similar to the crystal nuclei. No matter how well Jing Zhou mastered the sword work of Aoyama and was aware of his Dao fairy and the operating rules of the sword awareness, he couldn't kill him with one strike. As such, after the thin thread pierced through General Li's chest, it began to travel through his body, piercing through every crystal nucleus in his body with unimaginable precision and at the shortest distance. At least 60 trillion tiny crystal nuclei were pierced through in an instant, and then they were bombarded by the heavy ions released by the thin thread, losing their vitality. If this were all, General Li wouldn't have died. He was one of the most powerful cultivation practitioners in history. Even though Jian Shilai fought him with his life and created that dreadful and deadly sword style, he could only wound him severely. Though the heavy ions were heavy, They were merely atomic nuclei with a very light mass. Even though they traveled at high speed, they couldn't destroy the crystal nuclei condensed by the fairy energy. However, the heavy ions sent by Jingjiu a few thousand kilometers away by his fingers didn't come from a nuclear power furnace or the void of the universe. They came from his own body. They were the true heavy ions, having the weight of a single nucleus exceeding the upper limit of the known elements in the universe. General Lee lowered his head and looked at the thread piercing through his chest, remaining silent. He sensed the thread passing through every part of his body and the particles ejected from the front end of the thread, feeling a complicated emotion. Back when they were on a mining planet named Lindang, he mocked Jian Shilai for not knowing what the combination of the two civilizations meant. In his opinion, the perfect combination of the cultivation civilization in Chaotian and the technological civilization in the Federation of the Milky Way could be regarded as the integration of heaven and man. Seeing Jingjiu turn his body into a heavy ion cannon that day, he realized that he had already achieved it. Chapter 901. General Lee had experienced the battles many times, no matter whether it was the battle on that mineral planet or the one that day. He had used them many times, no matter whether it was the scheme against Jingjiu or other strategies. He had done the same thing back when he killed the king of the underworld in Ozawa and the mother nest by the edge of the big antelope. He had worked hard. He had thought hard. The future of the human race. At the end of the broad path. As Jian Shilai said before his death, he was indeed tired. Countless faint but thunderous sounds of collisions and ruptures broke out in his body, but they dissipated as soon as they reached the surface of his body. The stone man of Chinwu Mountain sensed the rainstorm-like vibrations in his wrist and was stunned speechless. He looked at General Lee, wondering what had just happened. He couldn't see the thin thread. It took a while before he sensed the powerful and sharp energy. The fireball generated by the explosion of the nuclear power furnace was still expanding. The shadow of the battleship grew thicker. The stone man of Chinwu Mountain sensed that General Lee's vitality was fading away. He let out a soundless, angry roar and slashed at the shapeless thread with his fist, dragging the shadow along with him. It was still soundless. A crisp sound rang out in the Tao hearts of the dozens of ascenders. An explosive sound rang out in the communication system of the battleship, making many soldiers cover their ears and squat down on the ground. Hundreds of them even passed out. The thin thread was broken in half. One of the threads was pulled back to the place where the nuclear explosion occurred thousands of kilometers away. The other was left in General Lee's body, curling up slightly, like an earthworm struggling painfully after its body was cut off. The shadow grabbed by the stone man of Chinwu Mountain was cut in half smoothly, and 3 of his fingers were broken as well. His magic method was known as the strongest in Chaotian, but it still couldn't resist this thin thread, or in other words, the all-in-one sword that had been polished. Collect them and study them carefully. The materials are rare, General Lee said to him while lifting his head. The strength of Jingjiu's body was unimaginably strong. No matter whether it was the military laboratory or the laboratory of the Science Academy of the Federation, they couldn't break his body with all kinds of equipment and methods. It was a rare opportunity that day. The thin thread was a part of Jingjiu's body, so they had to treat it seriously. These were General Lee's last words to the stone men of Chinwu Mountain. After saying this, he closed his eyes. His body emitted countless streaks of golden light, but he quickly calmed down. He didn't release light like the sun, turning into a crystal-like object under the support of the powerful will of the great Tao. Even at the last moment, he was still thinking about how to preserve his body and then preserve the filament in his body, which meant that he was donating his body. The stone man of Chinwu Mountain held General Lee's body in his arms. He pursed his lips and finally began to cry. The 1,000-mile ice ceiling formation disappeared. There was no cold air pouring in like the winter wind. Instead, warm air flowed out like a spring breeze. Huaxi's hair was brushed away, and the coldness in her eyes dissipated leaving only confusion and helplessness. He had already left through the chip on the back of her neck and returned to his kingdom. At the moment, Huashi was no longer that great being, but an innocent young girl born in the Hua clan of the Stargate base. She didn't even know what had happened. All she knew was that she had suddenly appeared in the dark and cold space, and that she would die in the next moment. She was extremely scared. The filament was cut off. Jingjiu didn't see any change on him, except that his fingernail was a bit shorter. Looking at Huashi's pale face and messy hair, Jingjiu thought of someone. He reached out his hand to set up a sword formation of Aoyama, wrapping her up like a piece of cloth. Then, he brought her along and rushed into the fireball created by the nuclear explosion as if they were heading toward death, as if they were trying to hide in the sun. The green light rope bound his wrist, making it impossible for him to wield the underworld fairy sword, and his speed was a bit slow. The officers and soldiers on the battleships and those ascendants could see the scene clearly. The melodious sound of the bell had gradually ceased. The whirlpool on the surface of the golden planet had gradually dispersed, and the ocean-like hot spring on the huge battleship had gradually calmed down. The young girl put down her small hands that covered her ears and straightened the collar of her bathrobe. She picked up the ceramic wine cup and said expressionlessly, "He ran away." She referred to the immortal Tan. It was unclear what method he had employed to pass through the defense system of the planet and disappear into the space under the cover of the scenic cloud bell. Looking at the light brown wine in the ceramic wine cup, the young girl suddenly said, "He ran away as well." She referred to Jingjiu. The ring was the essence of the two civilizations, and even the all-in-one couldn't cut it off easily. Yet, he could close the door of his awareness and prevent the information of the human civilization from entering his body. What she couldn't understand was why the inherited Heaven Sword, which was newly created by the great Grandmaster of Aoyama, couldn't control him even though the program was still in his body. The great Grandmaster of Aoyama took off his conical hat, exposing his ugly face. He moved slowly to the edge of the water and put his feet in, saying, "He has given up on himself." Back to what Jian Shilai had said to Jingjiu, the greatest possibility lies in giving up on oneself. How could he get rid of the control of the inherited Heaven Sword? Both Ping Yongka and Jingjiu had thought about it for many years. The all-in-one sword was an inanimate object, like the rocks by the stream or the ocean of clouds at the bottom of the cliff. It had no intelligence and couldn't respond to the sword, so it couldn't be controlled. In other words, it could be controlled by anyone. It was the sword spirit of the all-in-one sword that could be controlled by the inherited Heaven Sword. It was like a computer. The young girl in the bathrobe couldn't complete the formatting. The system was in a deep sleep mode. Even if one wrote a new system, it couldn't be activated. It was hard to describe the state he was in. If he was in a deep sleep, who could wake him up? If he couldn't be woken up by himself, it was no different from death. In other words, he was like that famous cat. A nuclear furnace exploded. Then, another nuclear power furnace exploded. Two suns rose one after another on the edge of the galaxy, outside the fog. It was because the explosions took place in the space that the shock waves couldn't be generated, but the light and heat emitted by the two nuclear furnaces still caused a great deal of chaos. They were like two big fireworks, blocking the sight of many people and making it difficult to monitor the situation. The sudden death of General Li had also caused a great deal of shock and chaos. Without someone in charge, the battleships couldn't maintain the sword formation of Aoyama. All they could do was encircle the area where the explosions had taken place. Normally, Jingjiu couldn't turn into a sword and fly as usual since he was controlled by the inherited Heaven Sword, and his speed was much slower. As such, he shouldn't be able to escape. However, as the fireworks dissipated, the people found nothing. Even Hua, she was gone. Only a small half of Jian Shilai's corpse was still hanging in the space in silence, like a bird, bringing the shadow of death and fear to everybody. Were Jingjiu and Huashi. The reason the meeting was held in the galaxy outside the fog was that it was close to the transportation center of the Scorpion Tail Nebula, making it convenient for the ascendants from various galaxies to come here. The military shut down all the entrances to the twisted passageways as soon as possible, paying no attention to the protests of those large enterprises and clans. As for how much the economy of the Federation would suffer because of this, they didn't even consider it. A few days later, the Scorching Sun battleship landed slowly at the base of the Longtail space fleet. All the officers and soldiers, including the captain of the battleship and the regular mechanic soldiers, were escorted out of the battleship and interrogated strictly. A few battleships of the latest model left the dock after completing their task of escorting Jingjiu, continuing their search. The Scorpion Tail Nebula was the industrial base of the entire human civilization. Countless ores and even small planets were hauled to the space factories here. A great many mining spaceships took off and landed every day. The military had to clean up the galaxy outside the fog in order to block off Jingjiu's escape route. There were bases of the space pirates on some of the planets, which could be used easily. Like the two mining spaceships destroyed by the laser cannons of the fleet, nothing could impede the advancement of a human civilization. The pirates who had lived in the Scorpion Tail Nebula for years, who could not be wiped out no matter how hard they tried, and who had done too many heinous crimes, welcomed their doom just like that. Thousands of electromagnetic bombs landed on a planet, creating an unimaginable scene of explosion. The electromagnetic bombs seemed to have a certain intelligence after being modified for many generations. They could penetrate the hard superalloys and penetrate the underground fortifications. At least half of the thousands of electromagnetic bombs penetrated deep into the Earth's crust before they unleashed their power to their heart's content. The planet experienced dozens of continuous earthquakes. Whether it was the underground fortifications or the fortresses and manors hidden in the mountains, they were all razed to the ground. A group of space pirates that had occupied this part of the universe for more than 200 years was wiped out. The miners and residents in the distant city heard the sound and walked to the top of the huge iron gate with complicated emotions. They looked at the lightning-like explosion embers rising from the distant mountains, feeling both relieved and confused. Then they heard the latest decree from the Alliance's authorities in the sky. The entire planet had entered a lockdown period, and no aircraft were allowed to leave the atmosphere for an unknown period of time. After completing their mission, the few battleships left the planet. The light of the star was no longer blocked, and they landed on the ground again. After a long period of silence, the crowd suddenly burst into thunderous cheers. Some people were still in a daze, wondering why they were so happy. No one knew that there was an electromagnetic bomb deep underground that had not exploded. When everything calmed down, the electromagnetic bomb opened with a bang, revealing a person lying inside. Jingjiu opened his eyes and stood up. He carried the military bag beside him and slowly walked to the ground. He did not fall into a deep sleep like the girl had predicted, so there was no need to wake him up. Of course, his current situation was also very different from before. The specifics were still unknown, but looking at his slow and heavy footsteps and slightly lowered eyes, he somewhat resembled Zhuoruzhui, who had just come out of seclusion. After a long time, accompanied by a ray of morning light, he walked into the city with the military bag and came to a very remote corner. He looked at the dark and damp sewer and tilted his head slightly, looking a little confused. The green rope of light emitted a ray of light on his wrist, reminding him that he had to hurry. He walked to the sewer and said in a hoarse voice, "I need your help." The sewer was quiet for a long time, and then a somewhat weak sound came from it. Hum hum. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.